Okay,
yeah,
okay.
So we're live.
Alrighty, welcome to the Bevry community. You can find us at bevry.me. I'm joined here today by John Buck, myself, Benjamin Lupton, and our guest, which we are interviewing, which is Taps. So you probably know myself and John already, but Bevry is a community for facilitating open collaboration. We've got tons of discussions like this. We're currently working through the Viveki series, so discussion every week. All the details will be in the link below, but let's get on to Taps. Taps, do you want to do a quick introduction of yourself? You probably know myself and John already, but
Hey Ben, sorry, I'm getting some.
Yeah, we got feedback from someone.
I think you must have it open on your end somewhere.
Let's get on to Taps. Yeah, who's got the? Do you have the YouTube page open, Taps?
Okay, so yep, that was me. There we go.
Yeah. There you go.
I'm like, where's that coming from?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
All right.
Okay, so let me close off all my YouTube. What is going on here? There we go. So yeah, I'm a digital nomad. I've been traveling for about a year and a half now in Southeast Asia. I left Zimbabwe after deciding to switch and move out of consulting. I was doing consulting over there with some organizations that are working with smallholder farmers. So it was a lot of agriculture and particularly looking at using innovation and technology within agriculture, right? So making technology actually useful for people that are having problems related to climate change, related to income and things like that in Zimbabwe. And I also work as a software developer remotely. So that's kind of how I feed myself as I travel and try and come across different ideas with people as I go and and grow as well.
So,
right.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, right.
Yeah. Okay, so a digital nomad, that's just meaning somebody that lives kind of without a exact like home space. But what is the digital component there? Is it just that like you use your work within IT or any sort of software engineering to fund yourself as you're living the life of a nomad?
Yeah, basically it's how you feed yourself is usually through the internet, one way or the other. So yeah, using the digital economy, I guess. And because that's the thing that really enables the long-term travel. Otherwise, I'd have to like travel for a while and then go back and work and do whatever else to earn money, then go back and travel and kind of do back and forth. But because I can work as I travel, I just go for as long as I want to.
Nice. So like you can just stop it, like you can travel really anywhere and then just stop at some sort of like a coffee shop or someplace with Wi-Fi and then just work from there.
Yeah, typically I like to go to co-living spaces, which is places where you can actually live and work for an extended period of time. They usually have like great internet, a good like workspace, and a couple of other travelers as well that are typically kind of in the same lifestyle. So it's a little bit more settled than staying in places where there's a lot of kind of how can I say turnover of people.
Right.
That can get a little bit tiring as well.
Right, and that's similar to like what you do, right, Ben? Where you find those types of places and then work for a while and then travel to some other place as well.
Right. Yeah. So for those familiar with the Bevry live streams that we've done, they may notice the background that Taps has right now is also a background that I used to have, especially for the Crime and Punishment video. It was filmed at the co-living space that Taps is at right now, called the Hatchery Place in Kuala Lumpur, which is a co-living, co-working place in Kuala Lumpur run by Kevin O'Lane. Great place. Kuala Lumpur is a fantastic option for digital nomads who are on the eastern side of the world. For ones on the western side of the world, generally they go for South America or the Caribbean.
Right. Yeah. Okay, so I guess we could kind of like go into a little bit of the, I guess, philosophy behind the living the life of a nomad, and like, does it? I don't know. At least for myself, I almost find it hard to comprehend, or not comprehend, but just to kind of put myself into the thought space of having no specific location to kind of like resort back to in a sort of like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, where you kind of kick your shoes off and call home. Like,
Yeah.
do you still have some element of that even as a nomad?
Not really. I mean, there's no place that that I go back to. I mean, I have family in Zimbabwe. I've got family in the UK. They have their places. If I go to those places, I'll stay with them. But nothing like of my own that's actually like, this is a thing that I have to go back to, or this is a commitment that I have there that I have to kind of deal with or rent or things like that. So in that sense, completely non-attached to any particular place. But I do think it's very much it is like a philosophy, right? It's a way of looking at the world. I kind of felt like I was this before I started traveling. And then once I started traveling, it just feels natural to continue this way. There are some people that just can't move from place to place, and there are definitely comforts that you have from being in one place for an extended period of time. And I think the nomad life would be difficult in that sense if someone's used to that way of living.
Right. So it's like you come to, or maybe you already kind of had this sense of you're like just thinking of yourself as a traveler, somebody that doesn't like just goes from place to place, or doesn't feel, I don't know, I guess.
Yeah. So for me, like, no place really felt like home.
Right.
Right. That feeling when you go and you're like, I'm home. Right. I didn't get that anyway. So I thought, well, I may as well move around. I've just gotten used to knowing that there's no place that I'm going to go to and feel like being there permanently. So yeah, I may as well see other places while I'm at.
Yeah. So it's kind of like even without all these like commitments and extra things that would come about would be entailed by having some sort of like location that you're based within. It sort of like frees you up in a lot of ways, that like you have a lot more, I guess, opportunities for like just doing a lot of different things that probably most people don't really think about or have that sort of opportunity or those freedoms.
Yeah, and it's actually quite, the way that I look at it as well, like the digital nomad kind of lifestyle is a pretty recent thing. I don't think it was really possible maybe 2 decades or maybe even a decade ago, right? It's something that's becoming increasingly possible for an increasing number of people as a lifestyle choice.
Right.
So I do think it's a very fascinating thing to actually jump into and start exploring this idea of being able to see the world and not having to be tied down to one place. It's like, yeah, it's something that definitely my parents didn't have an opportunity to do. And yeah, I think we're kind of shaping it as we go, like different people that are doing it, kind of making sense of it. Very different lifestyles. Digital nomads live very different ways of doing things. But yeah, I like it. I like making use of that opportunity.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for the Generation X's, like they had, the backpackers or the backpacking culture, right? And there's plenty of examples where they would, go to Africa for 6 months or 12 months or even a few years, travel around, even go to China back then. China was a bit more friendly to Westerners back then. But the difference now is before they would always have to do odd jobs, or they just have this huge savings account that they just diminishes. When the digital nomad aspect of it is, it's more the sustenance. You're able to maintain the same skill set and actually have a career where your revenue, your salary has a potential of increasing because you're working as a consultant or even a remote employee. So you're able to have that gradual growth rather than always sustaining yourself through odd jobs like teaching English or whatnot. But if you're starting off, because there's also the expat community, and the expat community is generally someone who then lives overseas for a long period of time in one specific location. That will be jobs like teaching English or whatnot. When the digital nomads one, just because of the internet now and so many careers are now remote, like if you're working with knowledge as your career, an information worker, be it recruiting or programming or probably maths or a lot of research or writing or a blogger or podcaster, a lot of these things don't require you to be in a geographical constraint. So that opens it up. But there are inconveniences with that lifestyle, which is visa runs. And also you develop great friends, and then all those friends are now based in different areas. But there was also the idea of the homes. Like, I think a lot of people, you know, what is home differs from people to people. And we have like Airbnb, they actually, let me just share the screen. They did this huge rebranding a few years ago. Some people may remember it, where they launched a new logo and everything. And it was all about, their tagline was belong anywhere. That's now Airbnb's new slogan. And at least that's like the world that's kind of presented, where your Airbnb is your permanent home. And that's why they also focus a lot more on inclusivity more recently in the more recent years. Because cross-culturally, there's going to be some differences. And I actually wrote a Medium blog post criticizing Airbnb's approach to that. Because I think if you're traveling, you also have to respect the local cultures. When they were more like the cultures have to respect the individual guests. Which seemed to be a little bit dodgy in my opinion. But anyway, one of the things I think to really gain your wisdom on, Taps, was the economic empowerment aspect of digital nomadism. I think that's what you're kind of focused, at least, you know, from what my discussions with you is digital nomadism, or these careers that do allow remote work, especially from the technology sector's focus on Africa. There's a lot of ideas of, hey, if we can equip people with the skills of a digital nomad, then they can get a lot of economic empowerment. And that economic empowerment really helps people, because especially for myself, like I was in Bali actually, and I was at a hostel, and I was talking to a few people, and there was 2 Germans, and they, you know, had your night, and there was 4 people, 2 from Amsterdam, 2 from Germany. And the Germans, one had a career in banking, the other one had a career in event management, and the Dutch had careers in medical. They were training to be doctors. And these are 9 to 5s until the day you die careers, with varying salaries. Especially in Europe, the salaries for those positions aren't high at all. Like event management is like $40,000 a year. It's not that much money. So when, you know, as a software engineer, at least for myself, they asked what I do. And I was like, well, I work 3 months a year, and then I can spend the rest of the 9 months doing what I want. And then I realized, like, I'm out of that conversation, because it's such a foreign world to them. Like, for the person who works 9 to 5, who likes that stability, who only likes to go overseas, the digital nomad life, it is very more chaotic, and that can wear a lot of people down. But at the same time, it's this great tool for economic empowerment.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I mean, in my particular case, being from Zimbabwe, there's first of all, there are a lot of challenges in actually being a digital nomad, like actually making the switch, just certain logistical issues, right? That some people wouldn't necessarily think about. Banking, like where you're going to bank, moving, where can you get visas and things like that. But there are a lot of people in Zimbabwe that don't feel that they have the means to move out of Zimbabwe, and a lot of it is economic, right? Because in a place that's economically depressed, you only have the options, what's immediately available to you. But the digital economy actually allows people potentially to earn significant amounts of money from outside of their geographic location, right? So they don't have to worry about what's happening in Zimbabwe to be able to work. And it was actually a conscious decision for my part. At some point I thought about it, and I thought I had to disconnect my earning potential from Zimbabwe itself, right? And from the ups and downs of the economy. And the best way to do that was to earn from a place that wasn't actually in Zimbabwe. And I do currently work particularly with a company based in South Africa right now. So it's still on the continent, but potentially I could work for anyone. But it is quite nice just being able to not have to worry about the economic situation of the place that you're in, for instance. So there are people potentially who could work in the digital economy in Zimbabwe and earn from anywhere else. And then eventually, if they decide to, they can then move to other parts of the world because they're not subject anymore to like the economic constraints of that country.
Right. Okay. So then, like, part of the digital nomad life, then, like you were mentioning, like one of the constraints is like you can't really have a bank since you're going to be going from country to country.
So
Or
you can have a bank, but in Zimbabwe it'll be complicated because the banking system has certain restrictions if you have a local bank account. So you have to look at getting a bank account outside of Zimbabwe that will allow you to transact internationally.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. But I was just also thinking, like, there's sort of like what Ben was saying about how for these other types of jobs like engineering and being a doctor, these are all things that are very much locationally based, where you have to be in this specific location. But there's a lot of like new jobs that are kind of opening up, like exactly what you guys do, and people that blog and do podcasts and different things like that, that have no such like locational constraint to them. That I don't know, it's I guess kind of surprising to think about, like what sort of direction will this lead to, like where digital nomadism will kind of have this sort of I don't know sorry there we go have this sort of upsurge, I guess, given that more of these types of jobs will be opening up.
Yeah, and I do think that a lot of jobs right now that we assume like require you to be in a specific location, but don't actually. It's more like a way of thinking that it's difficult for someone to leave or work remotely just because their boss thinks that, no, we can't. How do we know you're working if we're not physically seeing you, right? In your like office or in your cubicle, that kind of thing. So I think there are a lot of jobs that are like that you actually don't need to be there, but just the mindset of whether it's the business world or the people that you've been working with, the culture generally is like, you have to be here for us to know that you're doing anything. So I think, the shift will probably take some time, but it is happening.
Right. So yeah, I even know people myself that work from home primarily, but their job itself could be like done in any place. It's just the only reason they're doing it from their home is because that's where they live and that's what they're, I guess, comfortable with. And so like all of those types of jobs too could like be converted into, if the person were so inclined to travel or do things like that, into sort of living that digital nomad lifestyle there.
Yeah, and there's also an aspect of it, and kind of segues a little bit into the ideas that I've been thinking about. I mean, right now, being a digital nomad is quite challenging, right? You kind of have to go from place to place and reset up things each place you go. But I think as time goes on, there'll be more infrastructure for it. So places will look and feel a lot more like home, where, for instance, right now, if you want to have a place, you kind of have to take out a lease, right? Which is going to be a year, maybe or longer. There are all of these commitments that you have that are like, okay, you can't leave because of these commitments, right? You've bought furniture, you've bought fridge, you've got all of these things that are kind of stacked up. And then I think at a particular point, the infrastructure around, like, people will start being a little bit more okay with, okay, well, you want to be here for 2 months? Great, right? There's a place for 2 months. There's a community of people that are already doing the same thing. You can live here 2 months, 6 months, 12 months, however long you want, and everything is set up for you. Kind of a little bit like Airbnb, but more tailored, I think, to long-term travelers, because Airbnb is a little less so, and it is shifting in that direction. But the idea that I've also been having, particularly in Zimbabwe, is to create these kinds of communities where it's a lot more fluid, right? You can go to a place, you can collect like resources, you can do all the stuff that people like to do when they're in one place, right? But you get to kind of move from place to place and not be necessarily constrained to a particular location.
Interesting.
An example of this is in Malaysia. So Malaysia is a 3-month visa for most of the world. It's so a free visa that gives you 3 months. It's a social visa. So as long as you're not there working for a Malaysian company, it's fine. So as long as you're not locally employed, and that's how a lot of the visas work. As long as you're not locally employed, then you can work as a digital nomad. But Malaysia is also beneficial because it does territorial taxation, which again is to say, even if you're located there, you don't pay tax unless you're working for a Malaysian company or a Malaysian entity, which is very beneficial. However, there's one citizenship in the world, which is the United States. So American citizens, they're taxed based on the citizenship. Wherever they go in the world, they still pay tax in America. So even if they are in Malaysia, they're still paying tax in America. But for other people, then depending on their home country's tax laws, or depending on whether they renounce their residency, the tax residency in their home country, they could say go to Malaysia or one of these territorial tax places and then avoid tax. It's legal way of paying the minimal tax necessary because you don't have those tax obligations. Another aspect of this is there's the economic empowerment for the digital nomad, but there's also the economic empowerment for those in the areas or the hubs where the digital nomads reside. So for instance, Bali over the last 30 or 40 years has had tremendous wealth injected into their economy, as well as hopefully in Malaysia, we'll see the same type of things happen as well, because, and that's also the cost of life. Like in Malaysia, for 500 US a month, you can live in a 4 or 5 star apartment. It's got a gym, it's got a pool, it's fantastic. You can go to the markets, you can eat food for like $1 a meal, and whatever, or $3 or $5 a meal if you want something more premium, more fancy. So you can live successfully in like a great quality of life in places like Kuala Lumpur or Bali for significantly less than places like Sydney or San Francisco. And that money is then empowering the local economy to then gradually move away from peasantry type jobs into jobs that actually provide more return on investment.
And I guess for especially like within web development or those types of jobs as well, there's like no real connection. Well, I guess the only one thing that the drawback is not being able to make face-to-face contact with people and like actually interact on something more, I guess, personal, on a more personal level. That's why probably a lot more people live actually in San Francisco, is because they can do the networking with new people. Whereas if all your only communications is through like Skype meetings or something like that, you'll still be able to have the interactions that you need in order to get a job done, but it's not as viable, I guess, for making the inroads and connections and friendships with people that will really help you in being able to kind of excel in your career. So yeah, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so yes, but I also do think a lot of it comes down to the mindset that people have, because there is, like, you can't have the, how can I say it, like the water cooler conversation, right? Like sometimes a lot of office cultures or like different places have different cultures, right? So if you are in a particular company, there could be a culture, certain physical places where people like go and then they talk about different things, about their career, you make connections, you meet new people. And cities will be like that as well. So maybe San Francisco, there's certain events that people go to, certain places where they kind of mingle and meet. But I think there's also increasingly digital spaces where that's starting to happen, where people can actually meet and connect with people that you have never met in person, right? And still actually build a relationship with, be able to connect with, be able to move your career in different ways. And in a sense, the digital world actually offers more opportunities for connection, because you aren't limited, obviously, to how many people you can fit in a room, right? It can be in like a lot of people. So it just depends on your filter, right? How many people you can actually let into your digital space, so that you can actually keep track of. So yeah, I think a lot of that has to do with the way that we think, right? Like you said, like personal interaction. Everyone assumes like personal is in person, right? So if you're not in the same room and like physically in the same place, then it's somehow impersonal. So I think it's kind of a shift in thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's a fair point. Like even like myself, my own relationship with Ben has started completely online, and has entirely, like, that's always been the medium through which we've interacted, just because we're on other sides of the world. And it is certainly the case that my conversations and things that I go into with him and the other people in my or within our close community is on a much different level than the types of conversations or interactions that I would have with people in my physical space. So yeah, it's a very good point that it kind of opens up a whole new way in which to interact with people that would not have been there otherwise.
Yeah, it would have been very difficult, because in a physical space, you interact with the people that are physically there, right? So the level of maybe overlap of interests and things like that may be limited. So in a sense, that does force you to kind of spread out maybe some of your thoughts and interactions, because you're not interacting with people that you particularly have things that maybe you share in common with. But on the digital space, you can pinpoint, like you can find exactly someone who's interested in the exact like same niche little thing that you're interested in, right? And you can find those people spread out across the world and build a whole community out of them, and have, in a sense, I think there can be some very meaningful, I think, interactions that you have, and they go deeper, I think, quicker potentially because of that overlap.
Yeah, that's certainly true. Like, you're actually gaining an overlap of like connection with the other person on a more, I guess, mental level, rather than any sort of like locationally based things that you have simply through happenstance of like where you grew up or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. There's also reduced overlap as well, not just for, well, there's an increased overlap, I guess, for niche or specific collaboration, but there's also reduced overlap on everyday conflicts, right? Because if you're living with someone, or even if you're going to meet up with them in person, you have to agree on the same restaurants or, you know, the same activities to meet over. And especially if you're living, then, or the worst is traveling. Like, traveling with anyone always is a multi-day adjustment period, or sometimes a multi-week adjustment period. And there's plenty of rooms for conflict to arise in those situations. Whereas the online interactions are incredibly distilled specifically to interest. And that, to some extent, is a benefit for facilitating collaboration, because we don't have a situation of, you know, all those complexities of everyday life that we need to attend to. But for those everyday interactions, like, a lot of people, they're opting for co-living areas, such as the Hatchery Place, which Taps is at and which I was previously at. So, and even in 2011, when I set up the Idea Startup Hostel, which is now the modern co-living space, these hubs will eventually be more and more fleshed out, and the infrastructure for this remote collaboration will increase. So there's a website called Product Hunt. They do like there's like 10 startups that launch every day. So this is like a list of all of them. So if you just search like Nomad, you get hundreds of products that are always being released and new infrastructure going online to help facilitate this life as a nomad. And things like Discord or Slack, they're also easing that transition. Skype back in the day was kind of the first iteration of that. So we should see these things increase over time, and that'll get better.
Definitely.
So do you think there's a way in which, like, most of our human interactions or needs or requirements can be facilitated through the digital medium? Yeah, go ahead.
I think they are. I mean, it's already happening. And I talk to as families are being spread out, right? You're going to different states, if it's in the US, or different countries or different parts of the world, and you're having to mediate these relationships through the internet and keep them growing. Where before it'll be like, perhaps unless you're physically in a place with a particular person, there'll be like a gap, right, in interaction. We're like, oh, okay, I don't see someone for a while, so there's no real deep, meaningful growth perhaps in the relationship. Then you come back together, then you catch up, right, and then kind of goes on. But now, to a certain extent, you can have relationships that are deepening, right, even though there's long distance and there's maybe no point in which you ever foresee being in the same place. And I think it's going to become more and more normal for people to just do this. Right now, we think of it's like, this is a digital nomad. At some point, we're just going to leave the digital part. It's just going to be like, yeah, this is what people do. We won't be tagging digital on or like thinking, oh, remote work. It'll just be work, and this is normal. Right?
Interesting. Yeah, because I was just thinking, like, as it is, most of our, well, I don't know how much, like, to put a percentage on it, but there's at least so much more that has been facilitated through the internet that hadn't been there before at all, like Amazon, or like our entertainment. All of that is being coming through the digital medium, and at least with Amazon, you still have to have some sort of location in which to send it to. Is there a way to sort of like get around that for you?
Yeah, I mean, you can send it to a place, let's say like here at the hatchery place, right, where you actually put this address and they come and send it here. But there are also services where I can like get a virtual address, right, in a particular country, like the US, for instance. I can have a virtual address somewhere, and I tell Amazon to send whatever.
Just like a PO box?
Yeah, and they get it, they ship it, they receive it, they take a photo of it to say, okay, we've received this thing. Is everything that's supposed to be here? Here is the condition good? We can keep it for as long as you want, and when you're ready for it, tell us where to send it. All right.
Right.
And yeah, so there's services like that as well, even like for businesses and locations.
Right.
So
yeah. This is actually one of the
since Amazon got, or Whole Foods, I think, was bought by Amazon, they have a thing now where you can just pick up Amazon packages there at the Whole Foods. So like wherever those Whole Foods grocery stores that have those those mail boxes for that you'll be able to pick up anything, even if you don't have an actual address.
Right. But postage is actually still one of the main pain points of being a digital nomad, especially if you're in Asia. So Asia is very nationalistic, and they have import tariffs. So in Bali, getting anything mailed to Bali, even if it's things you already own, is not an option. Like, it's going to get caught up for months in the postage, and then they're going to try and extort you out of several $100s for something that only costs like $100. Malaysia, it's a little bit better. I think the cutoff is like 500 USD before the tariffs kick in. But because Amazon, like the United States, is blessed from such prolific infrastructure there. So for instance, in Amazon, like if you're in a city, you can get things even on the same day, where Amazon only launched in Australia a few years ago. And that means to say Amazon actually has warehouses. You can always ship, like, say, Amazon stuff from the US to Malaysia, but because Malaysia doesn't have its own warehouse in Malaysia, then it goes through the import duties and customs situation. So for instance, when I was in Malaysia, I tried to order some Nest cameras for security for my apartment, and customs seized them and wouldn't let them in without a permit. But Amazon being a great monopoly, so monopolies are only bad when they kind of disempower the consumer, but Amazon is fantastic because they have that great customer service, and they just refund you on everything. So it's like, hey, customs sees it, you get the full refund, like no questions asked or whatever it is. Any problems, you get the refund. And this will never happen with pop-up stores that are running with such little margins of profit. So like, hopefully, and for instance, I want to import a vegan djembe drum. In hatchery, they do drum circles, and I want to kind of set up something like that in Sydney. And I was trying to figure out, how do I get this American-made drum in Sydney? And they were saying, well, you go through one of our Australian distributor, but none of the distributors in Australia have it, and there's like exclusivity deals. And then you got to, it's kind of like the car dealership system. It's really weird when, hopefully they just give it to Amazon and Amazon can distribute. But would be even better, the way I think stores should move, is should have the drum company Remo. They should have locations in each of the major cities, say in Australia. And then you can try out the drums, figure out which one you like, and then there's just a QR code. You scan the QR code, it does an affiliate link to Amazon, and then it ships to your door the next day with Prime, right? This is such a better idea than each of these stores managing exclusivity deals for shipments and all the overhead that Amazon has solved perfectly through automation.
Hmm. So like, would the stores not actually sell the product there to you? Like if you walked in, try this out, oh, I want to buy
Well,
this.
well, the problem is then you have to have storage, and you need to, the customer also has to figure out how to transport it home for large items. That's not really suitable, but that's where you get storage. You have a warehouse around the back, and you have to get into the distribution and logistics business. Where if you're just a showroom, this is how Tesla do it. They have showrooms, and then you buy it online and it ships to your home. So they should just have QR codes, which just go to the affiliate link for Amazon. And then they get the profit, and they get minimal overheads. And it's a much better idea to me.
Yeah, because it kind of takes the small business outside of being the middleman. I mean, they're still playing a role there because they have all their product right there that people can come up to and like pick out what they want and like have an actual firsthand experience with it. But instead of having to sell them that thing and then they have to put in the order to send it back, send in the new thing that they have to put up for display again, they just say, okay, now this is the item that you want, we'll send it to you. Huh.
Right.
It's very interesting. Yeah.
But so to move the conversation along, one of the parts here as well, like a lot of these frustrations, like the visa runs, the import tariffs, the reduction of visas. So it's not just like visa runs like every 3 months. That's incredibly inconvenient. Like, because you get, say for Malaysia, it's like 1 week of packing, and then you got to find all your new accommodation for where you're going, and then you're 7 days outside the country minimum. But then 7 days like in Bali, like what are you going to do in 7 days? Right, so you're probably going to spend like 3 weeks in Bali or wherever you're going, and then every 3 months, like whatever you're focusing on is interrupted. And you also have the issue of, getting your rentals again, resorting. If it's a new area, you have to figure out all your routines and where you're going to shop. Like there is major inconveniences, but again, Kuala Lumpur is looking into a digital nomad visa. Hopefully it'll go, which will be a 1-year visa, which will dramatically reduce the burden. Currently they have tech entrepreneur visas, but they're a lot more exclusive. When a digital nomad visa would be fantastic. But I think with a lot of these things, the politics then leads digital nomads, like these inconveniences then leads them to, I guess, a more libertarian mindset, where it's just like these, there's so much legacy in this idea of geographical constraints of movement or of protections or possibility that don't really make sense when you have a digital nomad world. And so I want to move to the other area where I think TAPS is really insightful for it, which is specifically the farming and the politics, and also your experience with Zimbabwe. Can we get like a little rundown of your whole approach, because you're passionate about farming, so I want to get us a little intro to that.
So it's been pretty much a long process for me in thinking about the first question that I had when I was probably a teenager, actually, and kind of going through was, how does a developing country transition into a developed country, right? How do we fix some of these issues of like income inequality and poverty, medical facilities and all these kinds of things. And on one level, it was like, okay, do we need to work with the government to change these things, or can we do it directly, or do we build cities and kind of try and follow this whole industrial model? And it, I think, was more recent, maybe in the last 5 years, I've really been thinking a lot more around creating more like smaller communities, right? But I call it an ecological economy, basically. The industrial economy has been, quite developed over the past 100 years, and it's the economy that's leading a lot of the growth. But we always assume that is the only way to do things, right? It's the only way to actually grow and become a developed nation. But as we're seeing, that's caused actually a lot of problems, right? A lot of environmental challenges that we have are because of the industrial economy. And looking at building a different kind of economy, which is ecological based, right? Where you align I guess, capital incentives with ecological incentives, where the space that you're actually living in, it makes economic sense for you to protect and grow the environment, right? And so that's the idea of like an ecological economy. And an ecological economy would be based, like the very first thing that you have to do is have one where people can eat, right? That's the first concern that someone would have. So how do you grow your food? But in this sense as well, because it's a smaller community, you would have to grow your food in a way that is beneficial to you. And one of the things, the concepts that I've been, the really two concepts that I'm playing around with here, it's the concept of the distance from power, and then the concept of the distance from consequences. Where a lot of the issues that we're currently experiencing, particularly in developing countries, is that the distance from power is pretty far, right? So the distance from power is the distance between someone who's experiencing a problem and the person who's got the power to solve it, right? And this could be like one person in a rural area is experiencing a problem, but the person with the power to solve it is a minister in a government department, right? That's a very, very far distance. And on the other side, the minister, there's a distance from consequence, right? So the person who has the power is distanced from the consequences of their actions, right? So they could, take a little bit of money here, make a couple of decisions here that benefit them, but the consequence is very far from them. And the distance from consequence also includes the environmental consequences, right? So the things that we buy, typically, we're not, we could be, an area is being deforested, right, by our practices, but we are far from that. It's not like our forest that we're actually living in. We never actually see that. All the animals that are dying, we never actually see that.
Right.
So the distance from consequence is actually quite great. So within a state, right, the idea is to kind of shrink that in, right? Have a small unit, and whether it's 10 hectares or 100 hectares or 1,000 hectares, but the rule is the people who live there have to be able to eat there. So you can't import food to that place. It has to be sustainable in terms of food-wise. And so you have to grow the food there. But in that case, whoever is governing that place, the person who has administrative power, lives in the place. So the distance from power is very short. You can literally go to their house and say, look, you're not doing this right, and this is what's happening, please fix it. And the people who have power, the distance from consequence is also shorter, because if they make a bad decision, the consequences are pretty much immediate and they're right there in front of them. And all the environmental stuff as well. If you cut down your trees, then your income actually goes down because your income is tied to the trees. If you have more trash than you can process within the place, so you can't export trash either. You have to process it in the place, right? So I think all of this it will change our behavior, all right? And hopefully make us more aware of the consequences of our actions, both the people who are in power and people who are living within these areas. But the basis of all of this is certain, I think, the regenerative ecological practices, right, that I've come across, and these have been developed by people over years. So these are not my ideas, but things that people are already doing, such as biointensive farming, right, which is a particular way of farming that actually improves soil health and has really high yields, right? So you can actually feed families, feed quite a few people using this farming method, but it's not one that depletes the soil, right? It actually benefits soils over time, and it's completely sustainable. You wouldn't need to keep going and buying inputs and fertilizer and things like that. So the economics of that as well, when I look at it, is actually better economics than traditional farming methods, and some of these commercial farming methods as well. And like doing forest, like growing vast indigenous forests, right? So these are diverse forests, but the way that you grow them is you grow them very densely, right? You pack them together in a particular way where they grow extremely fast, and depending on how you actually decide, like the trees that you decide to grow, right? You can actually grow trees that have some kind of economic value to them, so that the natural fruiting process of the trees, you can actually harvest something from the trees. The way that I'm thinking about it is indigenous fruits that have their nutting trees in Zimbabwe. So the fruits have nuts in them, and you can crush the nuts to get oil. And the oil actually has commercial value that you can sell externally to cosmetic companies or to people who want to even like food products and things like that. But building up these layers of value, right? So not just one layer, but you stack it on top. You can start adding ecotourism, you can start adding training, you can start adding co-living, co-working, you can have people actually live there for extended periods of time. You can have a kind of these like fabrication houses, right, with 3D printing and these kinds of things, and start stacking layers and layers and layers of value on top until you have an entire economy, right? And that entire economy then becomes insulated from the ups and downs of the economy outside. So if the economy outside dips, they all still have enough food to feed themselves, right? They all still have the things, the basic necessities that they need for it to go. So it creates a kind of stability. And one of the things that I've noticed as well in the world right now, nation states are pretty fragile, right? And the problem is when a nation state fails, we have catastrophic failure, right? Mm-hmm. We have massive movement of immigrants, people are starving, we have war, only people who have like physical, like guns and things like that, people who are able to take control, because there's nothing to hold it, right? There are no structures below the nation state that gives some level of stability. Mm-hmm. And with the states, if we can find a way to kind of distribute these over time, the idea is if anything happens to the nation state, right? If there's any kind of fluctuations that are taking place, whether it's because of economic issues or political issues or anything like that, there's a structure that will still be able to like catch society. So people don't have to have these large migrations, right? They can still feed themselves. They can still protect themselves. They can still get on with life until you find a way to rebuild the state. So the way that I see it, it's potentially a different direction of development where we're not really looking at building cities anymore, right? We're looking at building these sustainable estates and spreading them over like the country, right? So that whatever happens, people have a way to deal with like basic necessities.
I see. So like even if there was some sort of point of failure within one of these like microeconomies, yes. There would still be all the other like necessary features to existence that are there in that same location, in that very small location, rather than like say, okay, we have this state over here that is mostly in charge of agriculture, and then we ship everything over to this state, which is, I don't know, in charge of democracy or something like that. And then this place fails, and then that other place, they can't come in. And so everybody that's here is left to starve, and then that's when they get aggressive. I think.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's kind of like every estate, right? So I call it an estate with an ES. Every estate has it has its own governance system. It has its own like information system. It's got its own education. It's got its own
cryptocurrency or some sort of currency.
Yeah, and even the currency, right? There's a certain idea that I've also been playing with where they have a reserve, right? So you can have a certain currency that is able to transcend an estate, all right? So you can kind of exchange, but it's really self-contained, right? It's almost like a quote-unquote central bank, but it's not debt-based. It will be kind of reserve-based. But so, yeah, the failure becomes, because all things fail, but what we're trying to avoid is catastrophic failure. If one fails, right, first of all, it can potentially get resources from the other place to kind of build it up, but the information in terms of the cause of that failure can be disseminated throughout the network. Like, why did it fail? Right. Can we protect ourselves against that kind of failure again? So it becomes a lot more resilient, and not just resilient. There's a term, there's a book actually called Anti-Fragile, which I the concept of that. It becomes anti-fragile, right? Where it becomes stronger over time because all the things that have caused something to fail, we fix them, right? And the entire network actually strengthens because of it.
Right. Yeah. So, I was just thinking of Nassim Taleb because like it sounds very much like his philosophy of localism.
Exactly.
Yeah. And it's especially the case, like if you have this small micro community that has this one specific practice that is unique to itself, and all the other micro communities around it have their own things, and this one fails, then there's it's like localized within that one area so that, okay, this one practice that they had that was unique to themselves compared to everybody else, that was most likely, at least, the causal factor that led to their own destruction. And that way it's not something that has this outward stretch because it's all localized within that one almost like closed system there.
And it's also like the people will still be like, the estate can fail for some reason, maybe financially just doesn't work, but the people can, it's a lot easier to deal with like one place fails and there are 1,000 people that need to be relocated and they go to different estates than to try and deal with 1 million people, right, that are shifting from place to place. So yeah.
So before we go more in depth onto that, I think perhaps a common issue one may have with this proposal is it sounds like there's a lot of proposals of constraints here, and I'm not casting a judgment on that, but for, let's say, most people in the Western world, they are in the developed world, they never have to worry about food, right? Like, they have enough money so that food isn't an issue. Especially then when we travel, and then food becomes dramatically cheaper. So it sounds like as if, like, for some of these proposals, that may actually affect a global food economy that is working well to meet the food demands of 1 billion people at low cost efficiently with high yields. But then again, it sounds as if the focus on the impeditive, what's the word that I'm looking for? Here is more specifically on how because if it seems like, let's say for certain African nations, I guess that's what we're talking about here, is that when we try and apply like a global economy directly to Africa, corruption can follow, and that's where the fragility really takes a toll. So then this seems more like a solution where if we apply this from the ground up, so rather than, let's say, we necessarily start restricting let's say global food supplies while we run this experiment, this is more about how do we build up these more developing countries with a more sustainable and anti-fragile way. So maybe like, say, Malaysia or Borneo. So Borneo, we have Indonesia's side of Borneo where the coconut and palm plantations are badly managed. They do slash and burn. And then you have Malaysia's side, which is a lot better in terms of its governmental management, right? But both of these are trying to meet the global demand for coconut and palm oil products. But palm oil is one of these things, which is, it is the highest yield oil that we can produce. So if we're then telling people, hey, move away from palm oil because of the deforestation, we're telling them to move to olive, that's actually increasing the amount of land that's actually required, because olive is a lower yield oil compared to palm. So it seems here, if we actually then can work with existing governments, or hopefully where governments let communities be their own kind of little micronations, then that type of management will actually be a better force for the global economy envision. Or are you saying that, like, because I imagine, let's say one of these micronations that is doing their in-house farming as proposed fails for whatever reason, like there was droughts or floods or any other natural disasters. This is one of the other benefits of a global food supply, which is when Australia goes on fire or it has floods, there's other nations to pick up the slack, or cross-seasonal foods as well.
So yeah, I mean, a couple of things to mention. So instead of, I do pick the name estate with some thought, because they're not really micronations, or they're not micronations at all, actually. You're not trying to create a country within a country. And I think there are certain people who have been going towards that direction, right? But I don't think that's sustainable, or I don't think it works, because countries are notoriously self-protective, right? They don't like the idea of someone having another country within them. As soon as you start saying, well, we're another country with a new country, you get into all kinds of conflicts, right?
This is like, an example of this would be like Liberland that is currently happening, or Somaliland is another one.
So the whole idea, like I consciously stay away from any kind of idea for micronation. So it's an estate. It's founded within the laws of that country. So it can be a trust if you want. It can be a corporation if you want, but it is a legal entity based on the laws of that place, and it pays taxes and does all these other things. But it just, like, within the land, there's just a certain way of doing things that has been established by the people, right, who founded it. So that's the first thing. The other thing is also, you mentioned this idea of like the difference between developed and developing, right? And how in developed nations, people don't have to worry about food because they've got the money and resources. But here's the thing: I think in developed nations, the fragility is hidden, right? People don't actually realize how fragile an economy is because we assume that because things have been going well, that they will continue to go well, right? A lot of people in developed countries haven't had the experience of having food completely disappear, right, from their shops, and it's kind of an apocalyptic kind of thing, right? In the apocalyptic movies, like, oh, there's no food, but in certain countries, in developing countries, right, in Zimbabwe, there's been times where, well, there's no food in the stores, right? And you have to accept the reality that the system that we built is actually a lot more fragile than we think it is. And by the time you need the food, right, it's already too late to develop that system by then, right? Because if at some point it collapses, right, let's say for some reason the US dollar just plummets for any particular reason, right, and the entire system of economy is disrupted and all of these things are changing, it's like, well, you kind of screwed, because if you didn't build those systems, or you trusted the government to have those systems in place and they're not there, right? And the issue isn't so much that people will starve. People probably won't starve, but you are only, the way that I look at it, you're 3 days away from losing your freedom, right? And that's how much time it will take for you to starve, right? You at that point, if someone comes and says, I've got some food for you, I need you to do this, you will do it for food, right? So it's also a matter of self-governance, right? If you've got your own food supply, and I know some people think of this as some kind of a doomsday prepper. It's not that. This is just common sense, right? If you've got your own food supply, if you've got a way to feed yourself for an extended period of time, then you don't have to rely on someone else to actually do it for you. So I think there's that part of it as well, where yes, this is definitely a direction that developing countries or developed communities in developing countries can go in, because those structures haven't necessarily been set up yet. But I think it could potentially be a way for developed countries to also start looking at setting these things up. The only thing with developed countries is there's so much legacy infrastructure, right? Legacy technology that people are very comfortable with what they already have. So the incentive for people to switch over to this may be less. So there's that part of it in terms of the kind of fragility. And then the idea as well of these like global supply chains of food moving back and forth. At the end of the day, this idea, the industrial idea of cheaper is better, right? It's not necessarily correct, right? It's cheaper isn't really better, because we know that in certain countries, certain things are just more expensive, right? But people also earn more. Right. So it's all about like these balances that are happening, and the industrial economy kind of went towards the whole like economies of scale direction, right? And at some point, you go wherever you've got the better economies, right? So if that's out of the country, outsource and go further and further away from the people who are buying it, right? In order to get these cheaper things. But when we look at it from a global scale, the communities now that are starting to reel from this, right? That are actually starting to complain about, well, like let's say in Borneo, like where they slash and burn agriculture, tearing down the forest, right, to feed, people in Europe, for instance, right? And certain people are starting to question, well, why are we doing this, right? Or is it better to pay less for an electronic device? Why can't we make it locally, right, where we are, and then the money that is spent in buying that thing is also spent within the community. So it becomes like a cycle within that community where the money is kind of rotating, and there is some overlap. So you do get certain things out from outside, things that you can't grow, things that you can't make, right? So there is kind of an in and out, but there's kind of like a balance of trade issue where you also have to look at, okay, how many things are we bringing in? How many things are we shipping out? And we have to kind of maintain this healthy balance within our own kind of estate economy. So I really don't think that if olives are the thing that are the like what you grow locally, and that's what has the oil, it's great. I mean, even if you're paying more for the olives, like for the olive oil, the money is staying within the community. So the people who are earning from that are also spending within that community. And that, I think, is actually a better way of building up the economy of the community instead of like shipping it away or forcing these like sweatshops and things like that.
Right.
Where you're trying to push down the economies.
So this is like the very common, like in Australia, you know, there's a lot of pride in locally grown food.
Yeah.
And Australia is a very nationalistic country, like many of the countries over in the East. But one of the issues with the Australian system is we have to subsidize our farmers heavily because they can't compete with the global food supply. And with a lot of nationalization on a global stage, then it's redundancy. And from a global economist perspective, redundancy is never rewarded because it creates things that are expensive and not competitive on a global stage, right? So for instance, we have Japan, which decided, hey, we're not going to grow food. We're just going to focus on the things we do best, because Japan was incredibly nationalistic up until a century ago when they had their ass handed to them in the world wars. But more precisely, they had the samurai, the Bushido ethic. We did a session on this in Bevry, where 300 centuries ago, they were local communities, where it was the ideal was self-dependence or independence, right? Where every samurai wasn't able to, like, it was shameful to have to depend on someone else. So the communities became self-sufficient, and trade was viewed as a shameful act because it meant that you were weak and you needed to be dependent on others. But then America rocked up with the big boats and the displays of power, and then that brought shame onto Japan of how do we compete with such force and tremendous force that America has. So then they decided to embrace trade, and then that was the Imperial Japan. And because trade was such a scrupulous activity, you know, the more scrupulous people engaged in trade, and it ended up with a lot of corruption. But then the population grew, and they didn't have the farming abilities to support this booming population now brought forward by technology. And that's when they went to the World Convention and they said, you know, we desperately need emigration out of Japan to be able to support our population. Otherwise, we will starve, and the only way to fix that would be a war. And then Australia pretty much said, no immigration, where we want whites only. And Canada and the USA just backed up Australia on that behalf. And then America continued to influence China. And then the World War happened, where Japan was trying to, you know, make sure its people don't starve by doing the forced emigration out. But, you know, that at least these are state reasons. Obviously, a war is complex. But then after that, Japan's lesson from that was, well, we should just specialize on the things we do well, and then export that to other countries, and then we can import food. Because otherwise you have situations like Australia right now, where our dollar is crashing. Like right now, it's really low, like $1.50 US for $1 Australian. And the only time it was ever lower was in 2008, where it was $1.75 for an Australian dollar. And that's just because the Australian economy, year over year, like we're just becoming more and more redundant, which is replaceable. So on the global stage, like our farmers aren't able to compete with global food costs. Our energy supply, you know, Elon Musk just came in and stopped all the blackouts in South Australia a few years ago, just because as soon as you're challenged in Australia, you export to either China or the USA, that brain drain, because that's where the resources are. And then Australia is just left with a lot of redundant work. So how do we rectify this opportunity cost of redundancy, as well as the threat that can be imposed? Because if you're the only, like say in Japan, like no one wants to interfere with Japan because they are so important in the global economy. Like if Japan goes under, then many other countries go under as well, because they're irreplaceable. But if you've got a redundant country, then it means you're replaceable. And if you're replaceable, then you are vulnerable to outside threats and forces.
Yeah, so I mean, pretty much all of the issues that you have mentioned are issues that are a result of two things. The result of urbanization and the industrial economy, right? When you have a large number of people living in a city, cities are fundamentally unsustainable, right? They cannot produce enough food to feed themselves. They have to bring food from outside because of the density of them. And then the industrial economy as well, this, and particularly industrial globalization, right? Where we're shifting these, Japan says, okay, we're not producing food anymore, we're just going to import all of that, we're going to produce something else, and then we're going to export that. And I understand, I mean, that system has made sense for a long time, but there's also a reason why I'm saying this is an ecological economy. It's actually a different kind of economy that has to be built from the ground up, right? And the idea is it's an alternative to the industrial economy. There's no way that we're going to change this machine, right? The industrial economy is massive, right? And there's no way that we're going to shift it. It's going to continue going the way that it's been going. But currently the problem is there is no viable alternative to it, right? One that actually looks appealing. And so if that fails, everyone's screwed, right? If like Japan goes down, like you're saying, because everything is so tightly knit together, right? If one economy goes down, then like a whole can start this like domino effect, right, of collapses. But on the other hand, right, it's great when you are a country that is vital to the system. But what if you're a country that isn't, right? A country that is a small state in Africa, and that, if you actually just disappeared from the map, not very many people would notice on the global stage, right? How does that country start trying to chase Japan, right? There is absolutely no way that you can ever reach that level, right? You're playing a game where you're bound to lose. You'll always be trailing behind, right? And so that's the idea with this whole developing kind of problem. Developing nations will never become developed if they're chasing the industrial model, right? Because the developed ones will always be a step ahead, right? There'll always be another step. So the only way to really change this is to just change direction, go a different direction of development, right? And it would be difficult for developed countries to adopt this kind of estate model because they've already invested so heavily into their current supply chains, right? They've already invested so heavily into the infrastructure and all of these things. But in developing countries, that isn't the case, right? They haven't developed as much in the road network, so as much into these supply chains. So there's actually an opportunity to go a different direction and start saying, okay, what does development in this direction actually look like, right? Ecological development, where we just live in a better world. We don't live in cities and these like unsustainable, like just like collections of humanity. It's like, actually, this is a place with, it's a forest, it's great ecology, you're living within nature, and there's enough food for people to eat. And if people won't say, well, there's not enough land, we can, like, if there's poor land, just regenerate it. We know how to turn like deserts into forests. Technically, we have the ability to do that, right? It's just a matter of will, right? And whether it makes economic sense. And if you've got an economy that's based on that, right, at some point be like, yeah, well, let's expand and just make some of this land which is barren, let's make it productive, let's put people there, let's allow them to feed themselves.
Right.
And the networks of trade will still happen, but at least it won't be to the extent of the way that it is currently with the industrial economy.
Right. So just one clarification, but I think it's now fitting in for the broader point. But one point of clarification is when you say cities are unsustainable, I'm not sure I would agree. I would say that they're not self-sustainable, but I wouldn't say that they're necessarily unsustainable in of themselves. So for instance, for cities, you can benefit from the farmers, and that's why kind of cities grew originally, because farming now allowed, instead of 80% of the population concentrating on food, instead only 20% of the population could concentrate on food. That allowed a workforce to then scale out. So depending on your population limits or the sustainability of a city, like let's say it's using solar panel or maybe nuclear, which is highly dense energy, you could have a city that, could continue providing those farmland outside in one type of ecology. So you still have the farmers, let's say the farmers on the outside, and then population in the middle, which engages in other type of work. Like I still think you could have a situation where it's 20% of the population is farming and then 80% live in a more densely populated area, which allows greater collaboration within that city. I'm just saying I don't think it's necessarily unsustainable itself. I just think that some sure are probably unsustainable. I'm just saying inherently I don't think they're unsustainable. I think that by definition I don't think they're self-sustained.
Well, I guess maybe I'm looking at it kind of in the same thing, because the way that I'm looking at sustainable is if you close the borders of a city, the city would die, right? Can it feed itself? That's my job, sustainable.
Okay.
Like if you close the borders, would it be able to continue to exist, right? And typically, that's generally not the case with most cities. I'm not currently aware of a city that, and maybe there are cases of that. I mean, I haven't done a study of it or anything like that, but it does.
Well, I would agree with you on that, and that's why I'm saying I don't think that they're self-sustained, but I'm using a different term of sustainability than it seems you're using. So my term is it would just continue in throughout in perpetuity. Is that the word?
Yeah. But I'm getting kind of your point there, Taps, that like if you have this one place that's producing all the food, like the agricultural area, and then you have the area where the population lives and works and things like that. They're like mutually working off of each other. But if there was something to go wrong with one, say the agricultural or the population area, then the other one would also fail because it's like relying off of the other one. And so in that sense, they're fragile because their point of failure doesn't reside within they themselves. It rather resides in something external to themselves.
And the additional point as well of incentives, right? Understanding, okay, so there's the idea of people within the city are incentivized to have cheap food, right? That's what they want, right? The farmers, on the other hand, want to make the most from their food. So it becomes this kind of like a zero-sum game, right? We're trying to push the farmer price down, but the farmers want more, and then the government has to step in with subsidies, right, to kind of fix the balance, right? But if these people are within the same community, right, then the community overall benefits, even if the cost of food goes up. It's not a case where they're losing anything because they are part and parcel and owners of the community itself. So I think it changes the incentive structure as well as the issue of distance from consequences. Right? Even if the farmers are like 50 or 100 kilometers away from the city, that's still a distance from consequences. There's some people who never leave the city, right? They have no idea the things that the farmer is going through. They don't know where the food is coming from. They don't ever understand these things. So their purchasing behavior, right, is different because they're completely divorced from the consequences of their actions. But if it's within the community as well, like within where someone can actually go to the farm, right, they may actually go to the place to buy the food or whatever it is, they can see the consequences. They talk to the people, right, the people that are growing the food, the people that they live with, the people that are their friends. It's a whole community where people can talk to one another. I think then people will make different purchasing decisions because they understand that this is going to affect someone that they actually know or someone who they know knows. It's not as spread out. A lot of it just has to do with some of these behavioral issues as well.
Right. So I think, so when I said before, there's that little clarification. I think it's just a different set of terms and what you're considering the system. That I think that was the clarification. But the larger point where I think it fits in for me is what we're talking about here is a self-sustained like I'm just going to use the word national because a lot of this correlates with the pros of nationalism, like a self-sustained.
National, but yeah, go on.
Right. So I'll say a self-sustained national economy compared to then the global economy. And the reason I'm using this term is, for instance, if we talk about trying to bootstrap a developing country into the global stage, then that leap forward that the developing countries are at is a huge gap. And that gap is a difference in power that then allows for more or dodgy competitive behavior, right? Like more coercive, more extortive, more dodgy deals, because it's possible. There's no leverage that the developing nations have on that global stage. And to maintain power in an economic situation, you need leverage. Otherwise, a threat occurs, and that's also for defense, like why nations still have so many nuclear bombs, because it's leverage. So it's not that they're necessarily intending to use it, it's just leverage. So for this, then, if when we say, well, it's a self-sustained economic system, then we could look at that as then a form of defense, right? Where it's a defense against the coercive or the imperialistic or whatever, the oppressive force, like the patriarchy, whatever broad term one is wanted to use for the imperial capitalistic system, right? Against, so in that sense, it can make a lot of sense. And to some extent, this is what individualism is trying to do with an individual. It wants to make the individual strong, an independent agent that is capable of self-defense, right? Where, the individual has leverage over oppressive powers, be it the state or be it a gang, which to some extent is synonymous depending on how you look at that, right? But so it seems this is taking it out from, let's say, the individualism mantra for the individual, like make a strong independent agent of an individual, to then let's make a strong independent agent of a tribe or a community or a locality. And then that way they can be more immune to the deficiencies or the viruses, or, metaphorically speaking, that the global stage presents itself.
Yeah, I think a lot of
the point is just on the global stage, right? Like when I raise, well, it's a redundant economy, how is it meant to compete economically? Well, the goal it seems you're saying here is it's not meant to. And that's when we're saying this is a different economy. This is economy focused on national sustenance of this locality versus the hyper-competitiveness and possible fragility of a global economy. So it's like, well, what is the economy actually optimizing for?
Yeah, and so with the national thing, I do prefer like maybe local, if you will, because there's certain, even the nation state, I think is fundamentally fragile for different reasons.
Right.
So I try and stay away from the idea of this is something that's supposed to bolster on some level nations, right? It's not the end. The end goal is not to bolster a national power. It can have that effect, right, when you scale it out. But it's more about communities, and then it comes down to empowering individuals themselves.
And that's the self-governance side, because the issue you're having against nationalism is, again, it's that distance between power and accountability. We want to increase the self-governance of the local community.
Yeah, exactly. And nation states, it's centralization of power, right? And so there are all kinds of issues around that. So for me, I'm looking at it in a kind of more local, if you will, village level, right? Of a group of community. So there is that. And then there's also this idea of, it's not like globalization versus localization, right? That are kind of seen as being two ends of a spectrum. But the way that I look at it as well is there are two kinds of globalization, right? But we haven't really been distinguishing between these two kinds, and we've just been calling it one thing. There's globalization, at least the way that I see it, there's globalization of control, and then there's globalization of access, right? When you talk about globalization of control, this is kind of how we are treating globalization right now, right? We have larger political blocks, right, where control is centralized through, like, the distance from power actually increases with globalization of control, right? The farmer, for instance, ships like a Brazilian farmer ships their products to Germany, right? So they don't have much control over what's actually happening, because the locus of control is in Germany, right? They are just, depending on the prices can go up and down, and then the government tries to protect them from these fluctuations, maybe using subsidies and things like that. But there's a greater distance from control. as well with economic blocks where you have, like, you build up like parliaments and things like that, where there's a higher like controlling body, right, over a larger group of people, right? This is just increasing the distance from power. And the way that I look at the other side of globalization is globalization of access. You want people to be able to travel freely, right, between these communities, to be able to move around, to be able to get things from one community that they need, but still have power residing within the locality, right? So we want local power, right, but global access, where you can move from one estate to another. And if estates if you have a global network of estates, perhaps at some point you can have an issue where, like, someone wants to move from an estate in Zimbabwe, they want to move to an estate in Europe, right? And the estate in Europe is like, oh, cool, don't worry, we'll handle all your visa issues. You're employed by us as an estate, right? And they kind of create another layer on top. They like abstract away the national visa system, right? Where it's like, oh, don't worry about it. Just give us, 30 days to process that, and you just come to the airport, and then you come and you live at this estate. And you can actually move around a lot more freely around the world, because these estates have taken it upon themselves to handle that legal layer of immigration, right? And so this idea of where we're not taking away globalization of access. In fact, you want to strengthen that, but it's just that this globalization of control that you're now like, okay, maybe let's have the control reside in communities and more towards the individual, right? We want, yeah, like you're saying, that individual power to also be strengthened, where you've got the ability to control your destiny, if you will.
Mm-hmm. I guess, I don't know if it's a problem, but at least the concern I guess I see in the, I guess, drive, well, similar, like your argument taps for why you want to not frame it as like these little nation states, rather as like the villages. It is because if like the broader nation itself had the concern that this was something that was not of its own variety, that was within itself, it would be concerned for its own safety and would want to put the kibosh on it quite immediately. And because it already has this large amount of extended power, it has that capacity to do so. And so there would be the desire to make sure that this is something that would still benefit the broader nation, but still not be reliant upon the broader nation in a sort of sense. And I don't know, it seems like in order for there to be, I guess, the trust still from the broader nation to this little estate, it seems like the way that trust is usually formed is through this sort of mutually assured destruction in some sense, but not to that broadest extent, but at least like, as we were saying with, like, you have the agricultural society and then you have the population over there, and then they're both mutually benefited through each other's interactions. And that's sort of like the incentive for them to be working together and like, okay, I can trust you're going to make the food because I'm going to hold the people or something like that. And so there has to be some sort of mutualism that occurs in order for the broader nation with the larger amount of power in order to even trust the smaller estate. And like, just like how Ben was pointing out, how for like individualism is all about putting the locus of power into the individual himself, is there's a certain sense in which, yes, that's something we want to incentivize and produce, but there's a other problem where for broader communities, like in order to have communities to interact with each other in a way that can allow cooperation and some sort of corporation of working together, there has to be some sort, like you have to have some sort of amount of trust in the other person, and that also is usually done through some sort of control in some sense. Like you wouldn't want somebody that has nothing left to lose to like take care of your kids or something like that. You want somebody that you can trust, that has some like anchor that's holding them down, so that you can trust, okay, they're going to do this thing so that they don't lose this other thing.
Yeah, and if I'm understanding you right, it's more towards this like idea. I mean, you mentioned like this kind of mutually assured destruction, like a relationship where it's like, well, if I don't do my job, you're going to suffer. But if you don't do your job, I'm going to suffer. So we kind of have to both do our jobs so that we can kind of work together, because I have some power over you, you have some power over me. In a sense, that's codependency, right? And in relationships between humans, at least, we find that is a somewhat unhealthy thing, right? You don't want to have the locus of power, even as an individual, reside in someone else. And if it becomes like this thing where it's like, it's what
you
I'm
certainly
saying,
don't want it to be a one-way interaction.
Yeah,
like
well,
they have all the power and I have all the dependency upon them.
Even if it's like a two-way thing, I do see it as being something that's fundamentally an unhealthy thing. But because it's so prevalent, we think it's normal. But you're right. I mean, there is a certain extent to which governments kind of expect this. However, I think,
and I do want to say I agree that like that sort of relationship is highly fragile. Where if one dies, then the whole organism dies. You have to you want to find something that still provides that trust relationship, but isn't that fragile. You want something anti-fragile, so that even if something dies, there's some sort of way in which it can overcome that.
So one thing that I've also learned from working with people within the political sphere in the work that I did before with consulting is there's certain, like the political sphere has certain incentives and structures, right? There's certain things that politicians like, and there's certain things that they're incentivized to do and the reasons why they do things. They're not always the same reasons that you'd assume, right? They're not economic reasons or some of these things. But so if you go into a political arena, right, and you disempower the politician is going to assume that you're an enemy, right? So if you go and say, well, you're doing things wrong, and we just don't want to deal with you and we're doing our own thing, then yeah, you're going to get that kind of backlash because they're seeing you as some kind of opponent. But if you go in and you actually work with them and you appreciate the role that politics plays, right, and the role that nations play, right, because there is a certain role that countries play, and if they're playing it well, then everyone kind of gets to benefit from that, right? Legal structures and kind of certain support system, and there are certain good things that countries do, and even politicians themselves. So I think it comes down to the whole approach, and it's a very sensitive thing. In Zimbabwe and a lot of African cultures, there's a certain idea or philosophy on how people live, right? In my context in Zimbabwe, we call it hulu, right? Which is a kind of a principle that determines how you interact with other people. And it's got a lot to do with dignity, self-dignity, the dignity that you give to others, how you treat and respect people. But it's a far-reaching philosophy. Broadly, I think it's been termed internationally as Ubuntu, right? Which is another name for it, I think, in a different language, in a different Bantu language. But it's this idea of like humanity, right? The thing that makes us human. And it is predicated on like social harmony. What it seeks to optimize is social harmony and the connections between people, right? So even if there is this sense of like local power, there's still an appreciation of the connections between people and the value in establishing greater connections. So the idea isn't that an estate exists and then it blocks off all contact with everyone else, including the people within the political sphere, right? No, you bring the politician within the estate. You say, look, this is what we're doing. We can help support some of the initiatives that are happening within the broader sphere, right? So the estate would also be involved perhaps with healthcare. Like if there are people that are trained within the estate to do healthcare, send those people out, right, to the district or whatever it is, the political arena, right, to assist, right, to help with whatever needs to be helped within that. And then the estate becomes a political win for the local politician, right? They can actually say, well, my district is self-sustainable. My district has enough nurses, and my district does this. The economy of my district, because the state pays taxes and they pay local taxes as well, right? The economy of my district is growing. So you align the incentives, right? You're not against them. You're actually working together, right? You assist in whatever the local politician actually, or the local political sphere actually requires. And at some point, maybe even having people that reside in the state being involved in the political arena, right? The local political arena, because you want to create these ties, because these ties now are the thing that it doesn't become like a power thing, right? But it becomes just the social harmony, right?
Right.
My,
sort of like,
my good is your good, right? That kind of thing. And the value of that. If things don't work out, we're not forced, we're not under the control of the local politician, but we still value very much the relationship with the local politicians. So I think,
that's a good way, if to sort of like lay it out. It seems like there's a difference between where your requirements for living are reside within the other party there, and like their requirements for living reside in you as a party, and so that's why you have to interact with each other, versus your requirements for living reside within yourself, their requirements for living reside within themselves. But when we interact with each other, we can produce something further or more, like we can build up something more, rather than doing so out of this like necessity to live, really. Okay, that makes a lot more sense that way then. So that would produce still a benefit for the politicians, because it's something within their district that they can point to say, like, look at how everything is going great for everybody there. They like me, I like them, they're producing taxes, so there's no like risk of revolt or anything like that against the broader nation there. And the little e-state itself is able to survive in case there was some sort of like broader economic collapse or something like that, because they have all of the necessary requirements for living right there on their own spot of land. The one thing I was kind of thinking of is, like, for certain I guess requirements for living, there is things that take up a lot more room. So like just agriculture itself, we tend to think of it as having, you have to have a whole lot of land in order to produce enough food to hold a broad amount of people. And so like, it seems like there would be sort of a population cap for the localist estate, unless there's some sort of like technological revolution for agriculture. And I don't know if you've implemented this into your sort of ideas, but I have at least seen some ways in which people have been like ways in which to yield crops completely underground, like using UV lighting and then supplying the direct nutrients to the plants themselves without having to rely upon soil. And it's kept within a completely, basically sterile environment, so that you don't have to worry about pesticides or different weeds or other things that might normally be problems when raising their agriculture. Is that something that you'd kind of thought about within relation to the e-states?
Yeah, so there is the concept like population density, right? I think if you do ecology, because the ecological economy, if you do ecology correctly, right, then it's not an issue of population density. I mean, when we talk about animals, some of the most densely populated places on Earth are rainforests, right? But they are these thriving ecologies because of the density as well. Because what happens is the way that we've done density is the problem, right? If you have a monoculture, right, and you have you're growing a huge like field of maize year after year, you're going to destroy the ecology, right? That's not sustainable, right? And the same thing, if you have like a monoculture of people, you have this huge city, right, which is extremely dense. The issue is not the density of people. The issue is the manner in which we're doing the density, right? We're packing them together in a way that's unsustainable, So we have to have these different strategies to try and mitigate that, right? And so I think even within an estate, it is possible to grow a lot of food, right? Yes, there are certain ways to do it, maybe hydroponics and things like that, where you stack up the food layer. But even then, I think even on or just on land, you can actually grow food. You can have very high yields, right, in small pieces of land that are like that actually regenerate the land and the soil. It just depends on how you do it. You can't do monocultures. It has to be mixed, right? You have to grow them in a particular way. You have to be conscious of soil health and all these kinds of things. But you can have yields that are comparable to or even greater than commercial yields. And then there's also this idea of, well, won't there be like maybe a shortage of land, right? But I like think of how much land on earth is like unpopulated, right? Just because the land is in such poor quality, right? In Zimbabwe, there's a certain piece of land which is, or certain area of the country which is called the Low Veld, right? We have different regions, and this area is region 5, which is like hot and dry, right? It's very difficult to grow things there, right? The population is very, very sparse, right? There are very few people that live per acre or per hectare of land, right? Because it's just difficult to live there. But we have, like I was saying before, we have the technology to actually completely regenerate these places into thriving ecologies. If we wanted to, we could turn them into forests, right? We have the means to do that. If we can build like islands in the middle of the ocean, surely we can turn this area into a forest, right? So the technology is there and the know-how is there. The issue is just the economic incentive, right? We're not incentivized to do it economically. But if you shift the incentive structure, understanding that actually this piece of land, which is almost worthless, right? Someone can say, well, it's 100 hectares, but you can do almost nothing with it because it's just barren, bare land. You can't even like have cattle on it because the cattle will starve on it. If we take that 100 hectares of land and we do intensive ecological regeneration and actually turn it into a forest, which can be done, right? Then that land we can all of a sudden fit like a whole lot of people onto it, grow a whole lot of food onto it. So when you look at it from that perspective, we actually have enough land. We have plenty of land that we could house large amounts, like vast amounts of people on it, right? It's so I don't think the population density thing is the real issue. It's more an issue of the practices that we've been doing and the way that we're looking at it. We could just expand the land that we use. The amount of money and resources that people are putting into building cities, like in certain parts of Africa, they're building these futuristic cities for billions of dollars, right? And you're like, why are we doing that? Why don't we put billions of dollars into regenerating land, right, in a particular way, and then having people live there? It's much more sustainable than building these cities, which at some point could become white elephants or an administrative nightmare, all right?
Where does the money for that city come from? Is that taxpayers or is that like foreign investment? Because I imagine
debt capital or debt, yeah.
Right, because if I imagine if it's foreign investment, like I know China is investing a lot in Africa, and that's generally to then make Africa a not essential, but like a valuable contributor to then the Chinese economy, as well as for the UN vote seats and things like that. But one of the other aspects is just like the way economy or capital works, like capital is purchasing power, and you need the ability to trade to be able to have any purchasing power. You need to be able to purchase things. So in a free economic system, then money goes to those who can supply something of demand, and then you purchase it because, through this means of money. So in regards to companies, like one of the things is like software companies like Facebook, Google, Apple, they're investing a lot in programs to then create more software engineers because it's of their incentive to then train people in that. And I would imagine that's what China is doing to Africa, which is let's invest a lot of money to then get the African citizens participants in the global, or at least the Chinese economy, to bolster them up. But then again, that's the same type of codependency that you mentioned would be unhealthy to an extent. But I also wonder then, against some of these just to Iron Man your proposition here some more with some concerns, which would be that I wonder about, so for instance, in Papua, so for those who are not geographically inclined, Indonesia is very big. It's all the islands north of Australia. There's thousands of islands, and one of the really big ones is Papua. And Papua is split into Papua New Guinea and then West Papua, which is owned by Indonesia. Now, in Indonesia is a very capitalistic and what would you call it? I would just say coercive government in its history. So, for instance, when communism in the world wars was breaking out, Indonesia solved that by rounding up anyone with any communist affiliation and killed them. There's a documentary on it called The Art of Killing. And they just killed all the communists, and that way they solved that problem, depending on what you consider a problem and a solution. Right, but in West Papua, you have the issue where you have tribes which live in the mountains. The ecology there is humans, jungle, pigs, and potatoes, essentially. And they've lived that way for a very long time. But then Indonesia comes and they're like, hey, there's gold or iron or whatever mining resource there is. And they rock up with the military and guns, and they either get them to leave or they shoot them. And this is very well documented. If you just search Papua mining genocide, there's lots. I'll just share my screen just for the live stream so people know. So for instance, like they turn a jungle into that, and if the people don't leave, they burn their houses or they shoot them. And this has been going on for a lot. And Australia, you would think, would be part of the support of Papua to be able to fight this injustice, but then Australia is very economically aligned, more so with Indonesia. So these type of oppressive things happen. And there's a huge Wikipedia page about this. Now, another aspect of this is that I think another area is where it adds credence to your argument is, say, for instance, guerrilla gardening. There's actually a book that I discovered in 2014 called The Moneyless Manifesto. It's like how to live without money for your land, your home, your food and water, your washing, your transport, your living off grid. It's like a little wiki thing. I used the Wayback Machine because now you have to buy the book, but before they had it as a wiki. And they talk about, like, for food and water, what's one of the growing options? Well, one of the growing options is guerrilla gardening, which is like curbside lawns. Now, curbside lawns, a lot of governments would actually try and make that illegal. And one of the things Mark Boyle, who wrote the Moneyless Manifesto, communicated was people have lost sight of what is food. They'll go to a store, they'll buy nettle tea for $5 or $2 or whatever for a packet, even though there's a nettle bush outside their home or outside the supermarket. It's a common weed. And so, we're taught to buy what is in a supermarket because that's the only way we can distinguish food, even though even in Australia, we've got plenty of like mulberries common throughout Sydney. Another one that's more common in Perth is lily pillies. They're another type of berry that you can eat, and these are common just shrubs that you see through the neighborhoods, and these are edible foods. But the government has been very stern to try and suppress this, and it's the same thing for the rental arguments. Like, for instance, they have a whole chapter on here on like free accommodation, like what can you do? So like squatting or say living in your car in certain areas would be appropriate. In New Zealand, they've always been very supportive of, I can't remember the exact word of it, but it's kind of, essentially nomadism. You can go wherever you want on any public land and it's fine, but they're actually cracking down on it because tourists have been coming in and littering. So now it seems like New Zealand will revoke that freedom because of the littering. But at least for the gardening, a lot of these things, to some extent, there's good arguments, but a lot of the arguments, it seems, where it's people envious of people not participating in this economic system. So for instance, if someone is sleeping in the car, the rent payers in the buildings or the landowners call up and then say, hey, look, there's a guy sleeping in his car. Can you ruffle him up and move him along? Even though, shouldn't be that much issue, especially, when capsule homes and other types of things are like say for instance, the guerrilla gardening, like the food on the lawns, like a lot of this seems to be trying to encourage people to participate in this economic system, even when there's not really a need to. Like the Moneyless Manifesto, it goes into a lot on how, hey, you don't need to work 9 to 5, 300 days a year or more. You can actually, just work to your means and then kind of rest a little bit. But I would then wonder for this, again, going back to the risk of, or the vulnerability of redundancy, and compared to the other economic argument, because let's say organic farming or permaculture-based farming, like these things are a premium in supermarkets, but people are generally paying for them, same like the vegan premium that people pay. So to some extent, like it's not just about the highest yield at the lowest price. A lot of it is also premium of what customers are demanding, and customers, as information is going up, are now demanding more sustainable ecology. So when we get this, let's say Zimbabwe, these little localities in Zimbabwe that are practicing the sustained, collective abilities, then what presents like a situation like Papua, where you get, a business that then says, hey, we're going to buy all of this, otherwise we're going to ruffle you up, or maybe even the government saying we're going to evict you all to build a train line, or we're going to evict you all to set up a mining. So what's the defense against force? And then because, like Japan, they have a defense against force, which is they're irreplaceable in the global economy. So no one wants to rough Japan up because they have that defense. Whereas, if you're redundant, then you could get roughed up, like what's happening to the Papuan tribes. So there's the defense one, but the other one is how the competition then with just normal economic practices, like as consumers start demanding cleaner electricity, more sustainably grown food, or more healthy food, or whatever, more green food, I guess, to put it on that umbrella, because I still wonder, like and then the third point is, how do we enforce these practices to continue? Is this state level enforcement to say like we should only purchase national food or local food versus global food? Like, so how do we enforce these values? Is it governmental, or is it cultural? How do they defend against economic as well as oppressive threats? And how do they? Yeah, that's essentially it. That's the.
Okay, cool. So with the first one about the defending against like this kind of violent seizure, all right?
Yeah.
I think there's a deeper issue there, and it's the issue between native populations and kind of populations that are based outside of it, right? So I'm not sure exactly the tensions between Indonesia and the local native tribes in Papua, and the kind of agreements that they have there. And I mean, there's a lot that has to do. I mean, governments, I think governments fundamentally, all governments use coercion. It just depends on the extent to which they want to use the power, but any government can coerce you to do something that you don't want to do. And then it comes down to the legal structures and things like that for the actual places. So as much as there are definitely injustices happening all across the world between people that are in power and local tribes or people that are native to the areas. And it also comes down to actually a distance from power issue, right? Because the tribes in Papua, for example, don't seem to have representation within the actual government structures or the military structures and all of this. So it becomes like a lack of power, right? They don't have any means to actually transform some of these things. So that's a very deep fundamental issue. In Zimbabwe, however, there are some benefits to that. So when someone wants to do a mining operation in Zimbabwe, they're expected by the government to do an environmental impact assessment. It's called an EIA, where one of the impact things that they assess is the community itself and what their operations are going to do, how their operations are going to impact the community, right? And so there has to be some kind of giving back to the community. The community has to appreciate their presence within the community. They have to fix what they're doing in the environment. So the legal structures are there to protect communities against pirate processes, as well as the fact that it is possible if someone in Zimbabwe finds a piece of land and they think there's gold there, it is possible for someone to actually peg that land and register a claim with the government and say, I want to mine there, right? It's not prohibitively, it is a cost, but not a prohibitively a high cost, like in some countries where it's just, you can't. I mean, you can't just say there's gold there and I want to mine it, right? There's just no means for you to do that, or the cost is just so ridiculously high.
And a lot of countries say, I think even in Australia, the government, like you only own like the first 5 feet of the land. Below the first 5 feet, then I think everything is government owned.
Yeah. So there's certain practicalities that you'd need to look into, because each estate would live or exist within a different legal structure, right? And you have to understand the legal structure within the estate actually exists. But what happens as well, the estates themselves also provide a certain level of political protection for the people. Because when you are a small group of people that have no economic power, you basically rely on external power for your own sustenance. You have no power, right? You have no means to actually even politically assert your opinions or your desires, right? And the estate actually gives a kind of vehicle for that, particularly when you start grouping estates together. They create what in political terms, or at least in Zimbabwe, is called the constituent, right? They're a group of people that's like, when a politician goes, for instance, they're like, my constituency is, 10,000 people or 100,000 people, 1 million people. And the greater the number of people you represent, the greater your political power. So it's a case where, unfortunately, the only means it's not the only means, right? But the only means aside from violent revolt, right, to work within a nation is to actually participate within the system, right? But you have to have a particular way of thinking. You have to have particular people that you represent. You have to have a manifesto, so to speak, and one that doesn't necessarily undermine the system itself. So I think there's you have to be very shrewd about it, like how you actually approach the government. I'm not saying that this would work in Papua or in certain other places. I'm not sure how it works in those places, but to a certain extent, and I don't think violent revolt against nations helps anything, because it kind of just changes one tyranny for another. But it's like, how do you actually effect change, right? And you need economic power, right? You need to have someone who's paying taxes to someone to say, okay, well, this is what we're doing. But if you have no economic power, you are completely reliant on the state, then your ability to affect change and even to change laws and all these kinds of things also becomes limited. Hopefully the idea is, if these estates if you create enough of them that aren't opposing the government in any way, but actually have a particular way of looking at it, it is possible to change laws, right? It is possible to create lobbying, and a lot of people hate lobbying, right? But the idea is, well, if that's the way that the political sphere respects change, then have a constituency that's got enough economic power to actually create lobbies for good things, all right? And then you say, okay, well, if there are people that are having these pirate practices in mining, and they're pillaging gold or silver and things like that, you create a lobby that goes to the parliament and all of these things, because you've aligned yourself with the local politicians. The politicians will come up and go to the National Assembly and say, this corporation is doing this thing, they're dumping mercury into our waters, or all of these kinds of things. Something needs to be done about it. And then the state machinery can start acting, right, in order to create change. But
right.
It operates under a certain set of laws and a certain set of principles. And you need to understand those principles in order to effect change. And I think potentially the estates gathering collectively as a group of estates can have enough impact to actually start shifting some of these government policies and legal frameworks as well, to get things changed that at the end of the day benefit their own interests, which hopefully are also ecologically beneficial practices.
Right. So this would be essentially, it's like a cultural manifesto, right, that is then also offering real deterrence against such corruptive forces.
And also, it kind of plays into the other question that you had in terms of how are these things kind of like regulate, like who decides, right? How do you kind of keep that up? And it'll go, I think, deeper than a cultural manifesto. The idea is if the estate is set up as a trust, if the legal structure of it is a trust, then you'll have a deed of trust, right? That actually outlines how the estate operates, right? And the governance and all these kinds of things with it, and who holds power for how long, how it gets changed, and who are the beneficiaries, and all these kinds of things. If it operates as a company, then you would have articles of incorporation or whatever structure that that company has, and you kind of outline certain things within that, right? And then even within the estate, you would then have a collection of practices that are documented. So it's not just talking, but it's actually clearly documented. This is how we do this. So for instance, if you're like, we do not allow any external food to be brought in, right? So you can, because this estate would have borders, right? It's not just anyone can just walk in through any parts. Like there's a particular gate that people walk through, and you'll be like, so what are you bringing in, right? And someone's like, well, I'm bringing in this, that, and like, oh, sorry, we don't allow this into this particular place. If you want, you can go in and you can buy plenty of food, right? It's there, right, inside. Or we don't allow plastic, right? Or a single-use plastic for things like that. And if you don't like those rules, you don't have to come in, right? It's kind of this whole, any private property has the right to decide who they allow in and out. No one's going to arrest you, but we can just say, no, please leave because you're not willing to abide by our practices in terms of the way that we do things and how we protect the ecology and all these kinds of things. So I think those things also need to be very clearly outlined. And you'll probably start having like estates that follow certain philosophies and principles and estates that follow another one, and like intermingling between them and shifting of ideas and these things. But I think that's also natural. But there will be a set of expectations for people who live within the estate or people who visit the estate to actually follow while they're in those areas.
Right. Right. I think that that addresses okay. The only other one then is the so essentially then this needs to get a cultural win. Like it needs to be something that is then within the. That's why I use like say cultural manifesto. Like this is something that is then opted in through the local community. So how do you win over the minds and the will of the people to get on board with this?
I think the good thing about it as well is you don't need a lot of people to start the first one, right? Okay. You can just, if you've got enough people to create one estate, you start with one estate, right? And it's self-sustaining, you've got everything that you need there. And only when people are generally aspirational. Only when people start seeing the success of one estate. So if it fails, it probably won't turn into some kind of cultural movement or anything like that. But if it's successful, if it does actually create like greater returns, like people actually become wealthy by living and owning like a portion of an estate, right? Then, and the quality of life is really good. People are eating well, they're living well, they're enjoying things. Then people may be like, well, okay, well, this is an interesting way of living. And then slowly, if it's successful, I think you can start gaining some kind of traction, broader traction. But the good, you don't need for it to become a cultural movement at the beginning. You just need one, and then two, right? And then three, and you can start systemizing it, even almost like a franchise system. This is how you set up an estate in a very short space of time, all right? And just like replicate and replicate. And you distribute like the lessons that you learned from each one of these states to help it grow better. And hopefully over time, if it works, more people will shift onto that model. But yeah, if it doesn't work, then yeah, people just won't shift onto it. It just depends on whether it becomes something that people find actually attractive as a lifestyle.
Right. It sounds like Somaliland, Liberland, as well as the seasteading would be good test beds for these.
I've looked into seasteading and some of these things. I think it can be done literally. All you need is a patch of land. Like just
Right.
get, whether it's 10 hectares, 100 hectares, or just buy a patch of land and start there. Because the Somaliland, the Liberland, and the seasteading, all of them are looking at setting up countries. Basically, they have to do all of this overhead and setting up new constitutions, new legal systems, all of these other things. But this doesn't require any of that. It's not trying to create a new jurisdiction, right? It lives in an existing jurisdiction. It's just a company. Even anyone else who looks from the outside will be like, oh, nothing to see here. It's just a company, right? It's just a normal estate, like a farm. Someone could look at it and be like, oh, it's a farm. People come in, holiday destination or whatever it is. It's nothing out of the ordinary in terms of looking at it. And I think in that sense, it becomes a lot more achievable. You don't need a lot of effort. You don't need to convince people. You don't need political will to do it. It's just buy a piece of land and start implementing the practices.
Right. Yeah, and you also don't need defense distributed 3D printed guns.
Yeah, well, not so much the defense distributed 3D printed guns, because that could be an issue. But I mean, here's the thing: in Zimbabwe, you can own a gun. Like if you've got a farm, you can go and apply for a gun and say, look, I've got a farm. I want to protect my land. I want guns, right? And they're like, yeah, sure. There you go. You register with the police, like anywhere and anyone else, right? Because you have a right to protect your land. Right, and private security is not a new thing. Like in Zimbabwe, a lot of Africa, and even in different parts of the world, right? You can create a private security company, or you can hire people specifically for private security.
Right. Yeah. So this sounds big thumbs up for me, because the I had another point, but that one flew out because I got another one, and this one's a bit of like a what is it? A curveball. It doesn't really affect what you've said, except I think it is so interesting. In South Africa currently, all right, we've had the what are they called? It starts with B. The certain they were like the white ethnic group. They were, I think, Germans. They migrated to South Africa a few centuries ago. Yeah, the Afrikaans, but there's a certain word for them. It starts with like B, I think, like would Boers, the Boers, yeah, right. So there's and they own like a lot of the farmland, from what I've learned, right? But then that's also caused an envy in the Black population there that is doing far worse off. And it's not even, from what I've seen from other South Africans, there's a guy called Serpent ZA on YouTube. He's a South African who then moved and lived in China for like 15 years, and now he's left China. And he had a really good live stream on it where he said, it's not just an issue against the Boer people, it's an issue with any immigrant or someone who isn't a Black South African. So it's either against Zimbabweans or Nigerians who have also migrated to South Africa who are doing better off. There's like this ethno-nationalism that is taking root out of South Africa that seems fueled by envy of the wealth that those who are contributing is. So, right, because I imagine like if you do this and then let's say it works in Zimbabwe, there's a lot of these very intense cultural disputes in the African region. I'm not sure how far or immune Zimbabwe is from the issues happening in South Africa. But what defense could there be against that type of envy? And in the West, this is the Marxists. Like the Marxists are exactly the same philosophy. Like let's look for those who are wealthy and then shoot them. Like that's what Soviet Russia did with the Gulag Archipelago. So
the historical context in South Africa and a lot of Africa is quite complex. Labeling it as envy is not just an oversimplification, but it may actually be a mischaracterization. The colonial history of Africa is such that a lot of the areas where the native population were living, they were forcefully removed from that land. And it's not like they were asked to leave. It's not like the land was bought. They were forced to move at the barrel of a gun, right? And Africa fought, a lot of African countries fought wars, extended wars in order to break out of colonialism. South Africa was the last place to do it. And apartheid ended in 1994. right, where it was a white minority rule, basically. So there's a particular context within South Africa that changes things. There is a wealth imbalance in South Africa and a lot of other African countries that is based on ownership of land. And that land was not obtained through good means, right? So that conversation is, each country needs to deal with it in their own way. But there has been a lot of talk within South Africa, I know right now, with the political sphere around this idea of whether it's nationalization of land or the redistribution of land and approaching from that perspective. In Zimbabwe, it's already happened, right? Zimbabwe had a very controversial period where there was compulsory land seizures by the government, right? So basically the government nationalized land that was owned by white farmers that they'd been using for commercial farming, and then they redistributed it to Black Zimbabweans. And it was done in a way there was no compensation offered for it. It was not asked for, or asked. The people were not asked what they think about it, right? So it was compulsory in that sense, and the land received by the government and then redistributed. And it's a very complex issue. And it has a lot to do with the colonial past. It has a lot to do with the agreements that were reached in order to end colonialism, and the promises that were made as well. In certain places, there's such thing as like willing buyer, willing seller, where the person who's selling the land has to be willing to sell it in order for the government to buy it back, because everyone pretty much agrees that the land has to be redistributed, right, on some level. But some of after the colonial period ended, some of the laws were like, you can only do it if the person who owns the land is willing to sell it, and you have to pay a fair market value for the land. But obviously, there are a lot of complications within that as well, right? Very few people willing to sell their land, and buying back a large portion of commercially operating land at market rates can be almost impossible for the governments. And then there are all counter arguments as well that the governments haven't been using the money properly. There's a lot of corruption and all these kinds of things. So there are arguments that happen both ways. But I think it's a very sensitive political issue. But I think it also must be approached with a certain amount of understanding of the historical context within it. And so I don't see it as a problem of envy. I see it as a real social issue where if it's not resolved, it can lead to violent conflict. This is not new in the world. When the distance between rich and poor becomes wide enough, the possibility of revolution and violent revolution kind of increases, right? And so the question becomes that a country then has to consider is how do their laws allow for a certain level of healthy wealth distribution within their population, right? And the way that I look at it is, and it's not even so much an ethnic issue, it's actually not so much, it's kind of the way, I like to look at it as proportional representation, right? If a certain portion of the economy has a particular characteristic, then they should be represented equally, or at least not too, they shouldn't be too wide of a discrepancy with their economic representation. So for instance, if for instance, an economy is 50% women and 50% men, but men own 90% of the capital, that's a problem. There's a massive economic discrepancy there. We need to find a way to rebalance this, right? And if 50% of the, let's say 40% of the population is a particular tribal ethnic tribe, and then 60% is a particular ethnic tribe, and yet like the 60% owns 5% of the economy, that's a problem. It's not proportional representation, right? And when there's no proportional representation, you're going to have issues that arise, right? You're going to have certain oppression, because it also comes down to economic power. You have a large group of people that have very little economic power, so they're going to feel oppressed, or in effect will be oppressed simply because their interests aren't represented. So in the situation
just to,
in Africa, yeah, go on.
Oh no, you can continue.
The situation, for instance, in South Africa and Zimbabwe and a lot of Africa, and not just, I think it's in different parts of the world as well, is if you have a large portion of people, let's say 80% of a particular ethnic group, right? but their representation within the economy in terms of capital power. So this isn't like the debt that they've taken out, or so I'm talking about like the actual capital that they own, right? If the capital that they own is a small fraction of the entire capital base of the economy, then you've got a problem, because you have a situation where a small group of people have a disproportionate amount of power, and a large group of people have very little power. And you can cut it on any lines, right? It could be gender, it could be ethnicity, it could be sexual orientation, it could be anything, right? But there needs to be certain amount of balance of like this proportional representation. So when that isn't happening, then you have a lot of people coming up and saying, hold on, what's going on? And you have a lot of this people who feel disenfranchised and this kind of conflict between people. So my whole thing is, how do we address this? Because it's a problem and it does need to be addressed, particularly within the historical context of how these inequalities happen. Because these inequalities were not organic, right? They were imposed on the system through colonialism. So how do you actually change that understanding the historical context as well? That's kind of how we look at it.
So just to play devil's advocate a little bit, or to participate as a naive devil's advocate, and what would you say precisely is the problem? Is the problem the likelihood of a revolution against those identity groups that have a minority influence? Because the common counter argument to that would be, well, if they're doing like it can be a bit crude to then divide power based on identity without taking into account the actions that those identities are doing. So for instance, in a fair system, it would say you do X and you get this reward. But if then two identities are like one identity is doing X and the other identity isn't doing X, then that would still, and they get different rewards accordingly, then that would still be considered a fair system. But if both identities are doing X and they're getting disproportionate rewards, then that would be considered unfair. And another instance where it would be considered unfair would be where identity B isn't able or allowed or has the opportunity to do X to then get the equal reward. So are we like, because we need to be specific on this, because otherwise it's a little bit problematic. So we're saying that because the solutions, one can be, well, if they're not unable to participate, that can be things like educational programs, like the tech industry is trying to do with recruitment and education, to try and expose women or other underrepresented identities to things that they may not necessarily have been what do you call it, included with, or experienced. But the other one would be, because if we're just correcting on, let's say, exposure, we're just calling this an exposure issue, then we could perhaps be rounding up people who don't actually want to do X, right, to then get that reward. And that's where it's like kind of an over-optimization. It's like the error correction is now starting to produce its own errors. So when we're talking about, like, say, these situations, we're saying it's a problem because one is, so out of the three situations, the problem, I wouldn't consider them doing the same, one doing, so group A doing, identity A doing X, and identity B not doing X, and then getting different rewards. I would say that's not really an issue, unless identity B it isn't able to participate with action X to get the reward. Then that is either, that could be due to racism, discrimination, or just inclusion or circumstances, in which case the society has to think, how can we better include them in these rewards if they wish to be included? Because otherwise we could over-optimize and say, like, do communism where we prescribe engineering jobs for people who don't want to be engineers. Yeah. Like, say, for instance, in Africa, in India, the Indian kids are kind of, you're either a doctor or an engineer. And if you wanted to be a painter or, something a bit less socially prestigious, then that is a great source of shame on the family. And that family has worked for generations to try and improve their economic empowerment. So, it's causing a lot of issue, at least in the Indian population, for the more well-off, the middle-class families who don't necessarily want to. And the same in China. There's a lot of Chinese immigrant students to Australia. You know, there's lots of pressure on them to perform and be top academic, even though they may not want to go down that route. So, you know, just for the sake of full clarity, what's your thoughts on that?
So, I mean, also for the sake of clarity and to be specific, I mean, for me, I'm not talking about necessarily education. I'm not talking about job opportunity. I'm talking specifically about capital, ownership of capital, right? Because we live in a capitalist society, all right? Capitalist civilization by and large. And so the main lever of power really is capital, right? And how much capital a particular group owns. So that's how specifically I'm defining it. So this is like economic power as defined by capital ownership, right? So in that sense, I think it is important to have this kind of proportional representation. And it's not so much to like, it's not about the risk of avoiding violent revolt. What I'm saying is, if it gets too disproportionate, then the likelihood of that happens as seen in history. But we're not trying to do it as a way of avoiding it. It comes down to philosophical issue, right? And it comes down to the idea of like some kind of form of justice, right? In terms of, and not just actually justice, but even pragmatism. If you have a system where a certain group of people, be it a minority, let's call it this way, a certain group of people, their interests are not represented within the levels of power, which is capital, right? Even politics, military, they actually all follow capital, right? So their interests are not represented within the broader kind of system. The system will over-optimize for the people whose interests are represented, right? That's just the nature. Everyone has an incentive, not everyone has a particular perspective, everyone has a particular identity from which to operate. And if they have power to express their identity or their particular philosophies, they'll go ahead and do it. We do it naturally. We can't really not do it. Everything that we do is an expression on some level of our identity. And it's not surprising at all if you have one group of people that have a large amount of power, expressing that power according to that particular philosophy. But what happens is the entire system shifts towards that particular philosophy, while that philosophy may not represent a group of a large portion of that system. So what you start having societies that are fracturing, because the society and the country, whatever the system, is shifting in a direction, right, which doesn't represent the philosophies of a certain group of people within that system itself. So it just makes sense to be able to balance these things out. It's not going to be perfectly balanced. If it's 50%, 50%, it's not going to be like 50-50, right? But it shouldn't be 5%, 95%. That is, it's an example of like an imbalanced system, because on some level, the system will try and correct. And if it goes one way too far, it could correct through collapse, which could end up being like that revolt or political kind of shift, or these massive kind of economic shifts. And we want to avoid these huge like shifts, right? We want it to be able to kind of tread to the amount that is possible, this kind of balance and middle ground. So that's the area that I'm specifically talking about, like the capital ownership. And it's complex. It's not about, and they're winners and losers, right? And that's unfortunately is going to be the case in any kind of redistribution, right? But the conversation needs to happen so that it does not end up being a violent redistribution, right? People just need to talk about it. Say, okay, how can we do this? How can we address this issue which is in front of everyone? And find a way of mitigating, whether it's a slow, stable transition, right? But the transition needs to be made. And everyone like understands that on some level. If we shift to education, if you have a large portion of the population that isn't being educated. For instance, maybe in large portions of Africa, women, like young girls, aren't going to school, right? They're 50%, but we know that it's like, well, when you get to a certain age, just women aren't having the opportunity to go to school. Disproportionate. Let's fix that on the ground up. How can we have policies and interventions that will help to create a more balanced kind of economy? Because women's interests aren't being represented in the academic sphere, for instance, right? Or things that are pertaining to women aren't being looked at there, right? So on some level, we understand the need for balance, but that cuts across all areas, I think, all areas of identity, including ethnic identity. So it's just something that we need to look at. Complex conversation may take years, decades to come up with some way of doing it, but I do think it needs to be had.
Yeah, well, there's certainly so the risk of revolution is something that requires an addressment, and depending on how it's gone about, a revolution could be completely ineffective. Like once the revolution has occurred, the same problems could arise depending on whether or not they solve the correct problem, because the solution really depends on an accurate diagnosis. Because again, with let's say the women's representation in education, is this due to women not wanting to go down that line, or is it due to opportunity? Now, I'm not saying this is all, right? I'm just saying in regards to the specific case, right? So then you have the issue where we should be presenting the opportunity, but we shouldn't be, prodding them with a stick to go down that way and then reducing, their own choices in that area. Now, so for this, no, let's get your feedback on that.
I was just thinking, I mean, when we go back to the capital ownership one, right?
Yeah.
And we're talking about like prodding people in particular directions and kind of ownership. It's human psychology is a very weird thing. And when you look at the colonial history of Africa, many parts of Africa, there was a very deep psychological impact, right, that it had on individuals. And that has particular implications for the things that behaviors of people. So for instance, the idea of capital of power, right? Economic power being equated to a job, right?
Yeah.
Which is valid in many cases because it is an important aspect of it. But there's a certain amount of education that also needs to be done just in terms of the nature of power and how power works. There are certain people that are living quite comfortably in debt, right? Vast amounts of debt. On the outside, they look quite well. They could be living from day to day a life that anyone else can see. But when you look at it, they are in fact disempowered because they may not understand capital power, how power works and how debt itself actually functions. Because whoever you owe money to basically has control over your actions to the extent that they can shift it and all these kinds of things, shift the debt burden. So there's a certain amount of education that also needs to happen in order to make people aware of how power actually functions, right? In certain places where there is a very deep philosophical tradition on how power works, how capital works, the kind of levers and military and political and things like that, it may be apparent to us. Right?
So an example of this pattern would be like, say, incredibly strict gender roles in Africa. Would that be one that you're talking about?
So, I mean, I'm trying to kind of limit it specifically to this issue of like economic power, because once we broaden it, there are a lot of other dynamics that we'll start dealing with. But specifically with the issue of economic power is that there are certain people that on the outside, right, the aspirations are around the things that look like success. So you've got a car, you've got a house, you've got a TV, you've got a fridge, you've got nice clothes, you've got all of these things. That's what people aspire to. That's their view of success. Because pre-independence or like during apartheid or whatever for these countries, those were the things that they didn't have, right? They didn't have economic power, and they saw people who had economic power exercise it in a particular way. So afterwards, you then have people who want those things. So they get into debt to get those things. They have a house, but they don't own the house. They have a car, they don't own the car. They have a clothes that they bought on credit. They have TV, fridge that they bought on credit. Everything looks the same, right, on the outside.
Right.
But on the inside, it's not the same, because the level of power, the measure of power was never in these things. The level of power was in capital ownership, right? And how money moves, how like this idea of capital engines.
Right.
So the idea is, even if you have people that seem quite happy to live their entire life in debt, right? To say, well, don't force them, right, to get
right.
It's like, well, there's also this understanding that needs to be gotten, right?
Right. Yeah. So I think, so to illustrate that point about the forcing, so a lot of this is about cultural aspirations, and as well cultural disaspirations, which is shame. So there's things which we associate shame, which are disincentivized culturally, and then there's things that we aspire to culturally. The wealth markers, like, the white picket fence house is a common one in America, right? Things like that, a nice nuclear family, if that's still the tradition, probably not anymore. But, there was these images of success, in Australia, it's kind of having a 4-wheel drive or SUV or whatever. So there's these images, but then when I talk about that specific, where it can become an issue culturally, where it's just the swapping of the problem. So, for instance, let's say in India, you would have the situation of, let's say for a woman, before it would be you are a housewife or you were nothing, right? Like, so that's the shame of incentivization and shame for disincentivization. But then in the West, it can go towards a situation where we say, you are a career woman or you were nothing, right? And we've just flipped it around when a better question would be something like, well, what do you actually want to be? And we're going to open up whatever opportunity is the right one for you. So if we apply this to India, instead of telling the kids now, you are either an engineer or a doctor or you are nothing. It's like, what do you actually want to be? And then we allow them to go down that. But then we still have the issue of, well, there's different actions. I'm not sure what's happening. John, are you seeing this with Tap's video as well? Your video, it looks like it's an old VCR recording.
Yeah, it's kind of weird, like a throwback to the past. The vertical hold is messing up.
Let me try and switch it on and off and see if that changes. Sometimes it does that.
It wasn't that bad earlier, but now it's really like a VCR recording from the 90s. Yeah. All right,
I just smacked the side of my phone in order to fix it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I think, at least with that framing, I would think we don't have any issue on that, right? Like, we should be opening up the liberal opportunities rather than employing any shame to disincentivize a particular option for an individual.
Yeah.
Now, we still have the issue then of, well, what about when those different choices of what people want, when it does come down to choice, still represents in different capital, and you have different things where, so we'll just pause that question for a minute, and we'll go to the capital. So I think we need to get specific on what we mean by capital here. So if we say capital in terms of, because a lot of people, they just think money is capital, and that's not necessarily true, because if money was capital, you could just print all the money and solve everyone's problems. But you can't print all the money because money isn't actually capital. Money is one means of capital, but capital is still purchasing power. So there's a great book by Cal Newport called Be So Good They Can't Ignore You, and he introduces the concept of career capital, which is you should have like a 30-year plan on how to increase your career capital, which is essentially your leverage. So leverage is essentially what a lot of people are trying to opt for when they see that pretty house or, the nuclear family or the promotion. I want leverage in my life to then give me access to to capital, be it money or objects. Now, there is an issue that I see, and which is very specific to me, because like the money situation, like if you just steal everyone's, like steal, you know, all of Jeff Bezos' money, you're not giving any more capital to the world, because the actual economic output or the ability to trade in the world has actually decreased because of the economic contribution of Bezos. But then but another example where stealing in terms of revolution is beneficial is, for instance, when the capital is something physical, which is hoarded, that can't be, which actually represents power. So for instance, this would be like land. If you know, you have a feudal state where the king owns all the land, this is a situation where stealing solves the distribution issue. And but you also have an issue with technology. So for instance, the NSA and governments, they have unbelievable wealth of technology, and it could be at a situation where their competitive advantage gets too far above what is tolerable by the population, in which case you just steal the technology, right? So these are situations where stealing, again, achieves the democratization. But if we just like steal all the money from the government, we haven't fixed any of our behaviors that cause the discrepancy.
And so the way that I see that there are two issues there. The first one is, yes, in a sense, there is such a thing as career capital, but this is derived capital, right? Or like even money is derived capital. The actual real like capital, right, is land. Everything builds on top of it, all right? All other things require someone to have some kind of ownership of a real tangible thing, right? Even if you're talking about minerals and gold and silver, it comes from land. If you're talking about food or you eat, it comes from land. All of these things, the platform on which all capital builds on top of is land, right? Everything else is derived. And in certain economies, you can have conversations around the derived capital, right? So we can talk about career capital and all these things, but at the end of the day, you also have to consider the real capital, the platform on which all other capitals are based, and how that is owned, right? And I think that's what controls. But that's why governments go to war for land, right? They don't go to war for career opportunities, right? They go to war because there's gold in the ground, or oil in the ground, or this in the ground, or like they expand territory. And on some level, we may think that we have kind of outgrown some of these concerns, maybe in this century, but we've just kind of abstracted them away, right? They're just kind of a layer below. But essentially, that's still what's happening, right? They're these kind of territorial issues, because at the end of the day, nation states exist and have power because they have control over land, right? So I think there's that part of it where, yes, there are other forms of capital, but they're all, let me turn this off and on. They're all derived capital. So in essence, we have to look at the real kind of platform of capital, I think at the end of the day, which is just land. I'll turn this off for a bit and see if it kind of resets, so that you don't have to look at a flickering image the whole time.
Your connection to the matrix is weakening.
And then there's also the issue of and then the issue of understanding. So this comes down to philosophies, right? I think we also live in a time where people operate in philosophies that we don't necessarily understand. Our philosophies are abstracted away. We make decisions not understanding the very basis of the decisions that we have. I do think that people, even at a young age, instead of teaching us like math or geography or language, like teach people philosophy, right? You get to understand the way in which the world works. And from that perspective, even if someone is making it, so we could say, for instance, we have empowered people by opening up their opportunities, and yet nothing is changing, right? Their behavior hasn't changed, because as much as you've opened up their opportunities, there's been no philosophical shift. And all societies have a particular philosophical like standpoint, right?
Right. So let me push back, because well, maybe not some pushback. It's some further stuff to it, because when we gave that example earlier of the capital, right? Like, you know, the person, they had envy for those markers of success. And I'm using envy specifically. Yaron Brook has a really great lecture where he uses envy as this, explains its role politically, right? So like we, as a culture or through marketing, we manufacture things to be envious of. And then that changes behaviors in people. So Anne also says, well, these are the markers, you want these. And that can cause that demand, and that demand may even be revolutionary. And sometimes that envy is correct. Like if there's no food, yeah, you're envious of the person who wants food. And it's somewhat righteous for you to even steal it. When, there's an excess, because it's within your nature to sustain yourself. It's the same reason why Germany, that type of defense, they don't, if you escape from jail in Germany, it doesn't add any extra charges to your conviction, because it's a natural impulse one would fall into. So it's not considered a crime to attempt to escape from jail, which is interesting. So, for instance, there's a book called Walden by Henry David Thoreau. He was a philosopher from 300 years ago, I think, and he influenced Gandhi greatly. And he wrote another book called Civil Disobedience, but his most famous one is Walden. And Walden is essentially, like a lot of this philosophical change, like say the person who's envious of the white picket fence, they work in the 9 to 5, like this was me essentially. Back in 2013, like I was working as a software engineer 9 to 5 in Sydney, an incredibly expensive city. And I was just like, how is this sustainable? Like how is this better for the world? And then I started, reading philosophy, and Walden was one of the big influences where it's like, hey, you don't actually need to work that much to have a good quality of life. Like you should actually think, what are the things you want in your life, and how do you structure your life deliberately? He has this famous quote of, I wish to live deliberately and suck the marrow of life. It's very famous, right? So like a lot of this kind of manufactured existence of, get the house, get the makeup, get the guy, get the girl, is manufactured to keep people in this consuming and disempowered state. And I see that, this is another example where just like, sure, they could steal the rise up against the bourgeoisie or the marketing class, I would just say, right? But the correct solution, that at least to me, would be like reading something like Walden, like that philosophical change you mentioned. But sometimes, like if it is a land dispute, right, like then you do, the means a bit more revolutionary. So yeah.
And it's also it also comes down
sorry, it was just one more point, because I think it's also important, because I thought, like, at least in the West, there's the now phrasing of equal outcome versus equal opportunity. So equal outcome would be, we want 50% software engineers, we want 50%. It's like a correct gender split. Like equal outcomes would be the demographics of a nation should be the demographics of every job, the demographics of every political party, the demographics of everything, right? Which denies individuality. It says you are now obligated to reflect your identity group's distribution, which is a little bit problematic, especially when marginalized communities are really focused on issues with the marginalized community and solving those issues. They're not really wanting super abstract problems to be solved, because they have real problems to solve. So there's that issue. But then the West is like, well, it's actually about equal opportunity. So let's present the opportunity. But the way that which becomes problematic then is then they measure the success of equal opportunity by whether or not it accomplished equal outcomes. And then you have the exact same problem, right? So it's very hard then to say, like, to actually implement a cultural a framework or a cultural incentive framework for equal opportunity without resorting to equal outcomes as the measurement, unless you then take into someone's subjective preference. So for instance, how do you then measure without deploying equal outcomes, whether or not someone is feeling self-actualized. Like that's really the measurement that we're wanting, and that is a subjective measurement. Self-actualization isn't reflected in whether or not they're an engineer or a housewife. It's reflected subjectively within themselves.
Okay, so I guess I'll comment a little bit on the ownership one first, at least the philosophical standpoint. The way that I look at it, even ownership as a philosophy, right? The concept of private ownership and what that means, right? And the philosophies around that, what gives a particular person the right to own a particular piece of land and to use it and all these kinds of things. And there are philosophies that existed within African societies pre-colonialism, right? And these philosophies were social in nature, right? So there was communal ownership of land and things like that, to the extent that even right now in Zimbabwe, there is communal land ownership. And I could go to the village, there is a village, right, that my family comes from, and I could go and say, I don't have any land, I want somewhere to live, can you give me land? And they will find land for me and give it to me, right? So the idea of destitution, it's not there. You can go and present and go somewhere and say, well, I need land, right? And someone on some level will be able to apportion land for you, even if it means taking land from someone else as a greater portion, right? So this idea of ownership was not the same way that, like, the idea of title deeds and you've got this land and you can't do it's a different kind of concept of it as well. And even it comes down to the philosophy of paying a certain amount of land to own it in perpetuity. It's a philosophical thing, right? Some people say there's no amount of land that you can pay for. There's no amount of money that you could pay for a limited resource to own forever, right? It'll be an infinite amount, all right? And even the basis by which we own things is only based on the ability to hold on to it. And the law that protects those quote unquote rights is the government, right? And they're protected by force, policing powers, coercion. They can arrest someone who tries to steal, and they have territory. So we're kind of abstracting all of these things away, but at the end of the day, it comes down to force, right? And the philosophy that all these things kind of builds on top of. So I think even the idea on the higher level of private ownership has a philosophical standpoint, and those philosophies can be different, right? And it's important to recognize that even when someone's saying, well, the idea of reapportioning land is fundamentally wrong, right? It's like, well, what's your philosophy of ownership, right? So it comes down to this idea of envy that you mentioned. Envy is saying, okay, something that someone else owns that I don't own, I want that, it's not mine. But when you look at the philosophy of ownership on a deeper level, you can say, well, actually, even the idea of envying something that someone owns, the only reason they can own it is because the government gives them the right to, right? By protecting those rights with force, right? And those things can be shifted. People don't normally experience these things, but the bottom line is the government does have the ability to do those things. They do have the ability to seize land, or at least even if it's not in their constitution, the constitution can be changed to give them the ability to do so. So it's within it's all philosophy. The constitution is the way that we live. It's all that comes down to our basic beliefs on how we treat ourselves and how people treat. And there isn't necessarily a right or wrong way. There's perhaps a harmful, beneficial way, one that makes more sense and less sense, but people can navigate it as they see fit. So on the idea of envy, yes, I do agree. There is envy, but it also has these kind of negative undertones. At the end of the day, when you look at humans, we're just trying to live like good, happy lives, right? Whether that's through money, through eating, like we do it through all these different things, but everything else is like, everything else is layers that we put on top of that to kind of help us get there. And some of these layers can in fact be deconstructed, particularly when they end up causing suffering. We may need to sit down and reconsider our philosophies when they're not achieving the goals that we wanted, which is on some level like happiness and fulfillment for a greater portion of the society.
Right.
So there's that side of things.
Right.
And then
so
I was just going to comment on the outcome. So yeah, I mean, you're completely right. On the the like equal opportunity and equal outcome. It's a difficult balance to achieve, but one of the key problems, right, is that we also, this idea of distance from power makes it such that the government is the one that has to be able to determine and fix these imbalances, and they do it through laws and policies and all these kinds of things, right? But because of that distance and that centralization, we can overcompensate, right, on one level or another. So it's, someone could say, okay, we need more efficient government. We need government that's more representative, government that listens to the people better. But maybe we just need to give people more control, right? Bring it right down to the local level, because these things become apparent on a local level, and nature automatically fixes these balances, right? By collapse and success, right? It kind of fixes these things where you have an estate, it kind of comes around. If you've got an estate that's overbalanced, right? And for some reason, this estate, 5% of the people control everything on the estate, right? And the rest of the people just don't feel that they have any representation at all. They could just leave, right? And then there's this series of collapse that takes place because there's an imbalance. And then people are like, well, maybe we shouldn't do that, right? Maybe we should do, so we don't know the correct ratio. We don't know whether it's 50-50, 25, whether it's proportional, but we need to have a way of allowing the system to self-regulate. And self-regulation can only take place when we start breaking down the units of control, right? To be really, really small, or at least small enough to react fast enough to these imbalances, so they don't become these huge catastrophic things that turn into revolt. So if we give the system that ability to move, and the people on a local level the ability to choose who has control of land, or who has control of who is being educated and who isn't, and then we look and we see it may well work that actually the best format is when 80% of the people in the education system are women. That could be the case, and actually only 20% of the men actually need to go to the schooling system, and that works really, really well. And we see this kind of proportion kind of permeating throughout the entire system. We're like, well, maybe that's the correct one. But the problem is if you do that across the entire country, right? Then if it's the wrong system, then we're all screwed, right? Because we'll only figure out after a decade or 2 decades that actually it should have been the other way around. But that's too late to change anything.
Right. So I think just something like, for the most part, it's like a thumbs up, and then certain things kind of seem like a little bit of a red flag, because like when we say, well, maybe 80% of women in the universities is better and 20% of men, like where the red flag kind of comes up is, well, is that something that is then enforced, and how do we measure whether that's a good thing or not, right? If we're measuring this by economic outcomes, is that actually a better measurement than a subjective questionnaire of, are you do you feel self-actualized, right? Because if it's economic outcomes, then we have the movie Ants, where we have the worker ant who wants to be a soldier ant, and the soldier ant who wants to be a worker ant, right? Right, so we don't want to be manufacturing people without any respect for their individuality. Like we want to be incredibly conscious of the way that we are manufacturing people's impulses and intentions and desires and their philosophy, right? Are we optimizing a philosophy that is optimized for economic production? Like, is that how we're measuring that 80% of the women in education is better, or are we optimizing it for self-actualization? Do you see like what's causing this red flag?
But all of this is also based on the assumption that we're talking on things on a national level, right?
Right.
On a national level, yes, we have to look at people become statistics, right? And then we have to start considering, okay, what do the statistics say? How do you optimize that? Are we optimizing it economically? Are we optimizing self-actualization? How do we do a questionnaire to measure? In communities, you just ask them, right? When it's a small enough system, you don't turn people into statistics. You don't have to manufacture philosophies. Philosophies are dynamic things. They shift, right? And people talk and they express them in very different ways. And but within a community, right, the idea is people's voices should be heard, right? If someone says, well, I actually want to go to school, right, as a woman or a man, whatever it is, their voice should be heard. Let's figure out a way to do that within this community. We don't have to ask a government whether there are like national quotas for the level of women or men or any particular gender identity within a particular area. It's just like people say, I want this, we're all a community, let's do that. But even with that as well, we do need to also start shifting. So there is the economic aspect of the estate, right? And it does need to be not just economically viable, but economically profitable. But there is a very significant social aspect of it as well, right? When I mentioned about the Ubuntu principle, right, or Hunu in my culture, it does optimize for social harmony, right? And the idea is people need to be able to, we need a certain level of understanding towards our own emotional health, so individual emotional health, right, and self-regulation, emotional self-regulation, and like logic, reason, philosophy. How do we work as a human being? This is before you start teaching people like engineering, all of that stuff. Just you as a human, right? How do you work, right? And people need to learn that, right? And then within that, people need to learn how to then interact with other people. So these are social dynamics, right? How do you resolve conflict, right? How do you listen to people? How do you share compassion, right? All of these things are basic human skills that I think we have started to lose because, to a certain extent, I do think it is because of this like nationalization, right, of identity, where there is a country, right, a political body that's deciding what should be learned in schools, learn this, and it's not dynamic. A government won't optimize for necessarily for emotional health, right? But we know that emotional health is critical for functioning community, right, of people. So I think when we start making these units, these systems smaller, like the estate, you also start to get these concerns coming up, like, okay, how do we resolve conflict just between people? And some of these older societies already had systems for doing this, right? They have a system for resolving conflict. They have a system for reparations when someone does something. They have particular people, like family structures, certain people that you go to with certain issues that you have, certain people within the family who will be asking you certain things, friendship. There are these very complex web of social dynamics, right, that already exist within some of the like older or African, should I say, even Asian or something. A lot of older societies have these social dynamics already exist. It's more some of the younger societies, the Western ones, that kind of came through this nationalism or the republic and these kinds of things, where a lot of these things had to start being codified. But codification doesn't necessarily bring out a lot of these nuances, right? I can't codify the relationship that I'm supposed to have with my uncle, right? You can't write that in a piece of legislature. But I know in Zimbabwe, there's a certain relationship that I have with the uncle on my mother's side. I can talk to him about specific things because they know that it's important for the individual's social health to have someone that they can just go to and be like, look, this is what's happening. My world is falling apart, or I'm dating this girl, or there needs to be someone who you can talk to of an older generation who'll be like, you're okay, you'll survive, or give you some advice, just on a social health, because that's how communities function. So I think that those things which will start coming more to the fore as we start building these smaller communities that are optimized for like health, right? The health of the individual and the health of the community, which does include ecological health, right? You could measure it on economic terms on some level, but that's not the end of it. It's not all about how much money you can make. It's just how happy people are within the community. So I think that shift will naturally happen. And I think fundamentally, governments, any national structure is bad at this. They can't, because they use laws, they codify things, right? And so for them to be able to change, it's difficult. And then when they try and do it, it becomes indoctrination, right? They try and push philosophies through schools en masse, and it becomes this whole indoctrination drive, which isn't good either, right? Because you're trying to manufacture, again, like people with a particular philosophical viewpoint but that philosophical viewpoint could be wrong. And then you spent like 2 decades manufacturing people who have a particular philosophy. The philosophy collapses, right? Or people aren't willing to change because they're too deeply invested in it. And then it's like, oh, we start again. Then we start trying to indoctrinate people with a new philosophy. But it's like the whole system, when you try and administrate like 20 million people using one system, it just, I don't think it works. It can't achieve balance in the long term.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So that's fair enough, because the just another illustration that came to my mind a bit ago was the like, say for instance, when let's say, you know, I'm envious of X object that has been marketed to me by society, right?
Mm-hmm.
Specifically about that, I'm not saying that all objects we envy are marketed to us. I'm just saying in this example, right? So in this example, let's say it's a house. Right now, you know, if I have envy on that, that's just saying I want that to because I feel as
Did he cut out for you as well?
Yeah, he did. I was wondering whether it was me who cut out.
Oh no.
Okay, so it looks like Ben is the one who cut out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whoops. Sorry, everybody. Not sure where he was really going with that. We'll see if he comes back on.
Comes back
yeah.
on.
Did he leave the call entirely, or it says he's
like
still
he's still
in
on
here?
The call.
Yeah.
Maybe we can send him a message.
Yeah. Whoops. All right. Well, we'll probably be wrapping up soon. In a second. Do you have anything like during this time, I guess, to plug for our audience? Like, are you online? Do you have a blog or social media presence at all?
So I do have a blog, and I do have a social media presence, but it's really minimal at this point. From the conversation that I had with Ben, I'm actually shifting more towards putting these ideas online and putting it in a way that people can actually understand and interact with, and just writing them down and kind of getting feedback. So I am actually looking at setting up a website where people can actually go to and then find out more about this and also interact on email, etc. So the site it's not currently up at all, but it will actually be ecologicalestates.com. And just a place where people will be able to like see it. So perhaps checking in a week or two to see how that goes. Otherwise, on social media, taps Murove, you can just kind of find me either on Instagram or something like that, and or on Facebook, and we can connect there as well if someone's interested in having a deeper conversation around this.
Cool. All right, and that's taps Murove. Murove for
yes, so
anybody.
It'll be like taps.murove, Murove.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. Well, I don't know if Ben's coming back at all. Let's see, he might have been hit the big one. Is there anything you want to kind of like wrap up on, or like put any final words out on?
No, I really enjoy conversations like this because I think they just need to happen, and kind of deconstructing in some of the things that we believe in and exploring different ways of doing things. I think it's a beneficial exercise, but also more so we need to start looking at how to practically do it, right, on the ground. So any kind of effort to do these things, I definitely celebrate and love engaging with that. So I definitely appreciate the opportunity to share all of these ideas as well on this platform with you and Ben and the Bevry community as well. So that's something as well that I really appreciate. So yeah, thank you for having me on, for sure.
Yeah, well, this has been really awesome. Like just being able to hear from you and get a lot of answers to these questions that we had, and also just being able to hear your kind of like conceptualization of the little ecological states. That it's a really fascinating idea to like. I want to like definitely play around with it more, and also like actually kind of think about what it would be like in practice as well, because that it's not just something that can like resides as a concept,
Yep.
I think it has a lot of utility in putting into practice and trying to build up from. So
yeah, thank you very much. And also, just to also explain, I am actually looking at building it up for the purpose of building a pilot, right? Of actually getting a piece of land and actually doing all of this and testing it out, right? And seeing, does this actually work? In what ways does it need to be changed? And how can we actually turn it into a system that can grow? So that's really my direction. It's an idea, yes, that I have and that I've developed, but at the same time, I really want to build it into an actual pilot and test it on the ground and see how it functions.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's really cool. So like, would it have, I guess, like, what's the minimal amount that would be necessary to sort of get started on that?
And so in terms of land-wise, I'm looking at getting 10 hectares of land, and then kind of building it up from there. The land itself in Zimbabwe isn't particularly expensive, but I'm looking at different models in terms of how to actually fund it. Should I purchase it myself? Because the whole operation, particularly a large portion of the finances, isn't actually so much about the land purchasing, because that's the smaller part of it. It's more about the land regeneration of it, right? Where you're actually building forests and you're starting up some of these things, and you're building the houses and all of these kinds of things. And to be completely honest, I don't have a figure off the top of my head. It's kind of one of these things that I have to discover as we go along, because it's not necessarily something that's been done in this way. There are isolated cases of someone doing, planting a forest, for instance, or someone doing like land management, or someone doing a particular house. But the dynamics of bringing it all together, I think, a little bit more complicated. But on the front end, like in Zimbabwe, getting $10,000 to buy a piece of land is the first step, and then from there, just kind of growing and building it. Yeah.
Right. All right. Looks like Ben is back, I think.
Back.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're in an old apartment, and it can only handle too much electrical output before it shuts off everything, which is, I should get a UPS. I'll get 2 UPSs maybe, or when that happens next time. But 1 UPS for the computer, 1 UPS for the internet. But yeah, I can resume what I'm saying if you guys.
Sure.
Yep. So I was talking about the envy situation. So like, so one of the things that we have envy over are like manufactured desires. So let's say that's the house, right? Now, one example of solving this situation would be I would just go to the person's house, shoot them dead, and then claim the house, right? And, and that could be like, a MacBook or whatever it is, right? A lot of these things, but chances are, I would say that doesn't offer fulfillment unless you're a king level gangster, right? And if you're a king level gangster, then that's a sustainable way, at least for your own self, on acquiring things that you're envious of. But I think, the more sustainable long term, which I would then become moral way of doing that, would then be saying like, well, what I'm envious of isn't necessarily that, but the ability to acquire that playing a fair game. Which is then the role of philosophy to then define fair, but it's also, the role of then, as you said, the society to then present opportunities, or the community, I should say, if we're speaking more locally, to present that. So you say to the community, hey, I'm envious of this, then the community can devise plans that hopefully aren't butchering the person who owns it. So I like a lot of the, the solution to these type of red flags is then the self-governance and the self-emergent and localized abilities for regulation or for governance. So, if we make it so, because a lot of this framework, if we think about it visually, is kind of like a container landscape or an economy. It seems, which is to then say that by reducing the competitive landscape, this is the same situation. Am I still there, or did the internet? Okay.
No, yeah, you cut out for like a second.
Yeah, you cut on my side as well for that.
Okay. I'll just turn my video off. Yeah, so we have the, so for instance, like an example where a global competitive market is incredibly problematic would be Instagram, right? So Instagram introduces or kind of manufactures hypersexualization within women, which is it's communicating to women, you're participating on a global stage with other women, which isn't true. The women are not participating on a global stage, although that's what Instagram communicates. The women are participating only on the stage of the local community. That's where the competition is. And when you're participating in your local community, that's also against the philosophy or the values of that community, right? Whereas if you're participating on a global stage, that's not a global set of values. It's not a cohesive uniform. This is anything. That's why it's very confusing when you look at the global stage and then there's big ass women who are fat with a P, who are attractive, and then there's the skinny women who are attractive. You know, you have this whole range of what all the different cultures and individuals around the world are finding attractive, and it's confusing. So you end up with this hypersexualized, hyper-optimized. It's the same thing with a manufactured gym bro. That's, you know, seems to be the what's occurring to men, where it's just like, you have to go to the gym, you have to be big, you have to get the wealth, you have to wear a suit, but then also party on the weekends, right? You know, and that's this manufactured existence, like, oh, I'm with the boys, right? And all that's crap. So this is also like an example where a global competitive market is incredibly damaging to individuals, because we're still operating in community competitive landscapes. And it seems, so a lot of the ways that these red flags that I'm raising seem to be introduced is by acknowledging that we're reducing the competitive landscape to where it is actually applicable and sensible to do so. And then also to then reduce, you know, to increase the feedback mechanism. So that's things such like, you know, to some extent it's called direct democracy, but, you know, to an extent, democracy is also the majority is the game. And that has its own issues. So you need a direct democracy. So a company is a great example of a direct democracy when the company is run well. So for instance, like Apple's Apple Park headquarters, that's a great example of facilitating feedback and collaboration and reducing the feedback loops between, because of its, you know, open space, but yet still focused situations which allow people to work. But then you know, an issue where you have a bad direct democracy is when you just get a whole bunch of people together and then 8 out of 10 of them vote to steal the resources from 2 or rape or kill them. So, you know, this is, you're stranded on a, you know, your boat sunk and you're stranded on an island. Let's just do majority rule. And then these are bad. So you need a democracy that is bound by a good constitution, but then allow individual groups the freedom to experiment with that constitution. And that seems to be like that self-emergent property of, well, we discuss and we do the feedback and we find out locally with these communities what work. But and then you have to hope as well from that reduced competitive landscape that other communities will respect that. And that's where you know, working with existing communities, or, you know, this intranet of, or extranet of other communities and good diplomatic relationships can help occur to prevent situations like what's happening in Papua.
Yeah.
Do you think that's a fair assessment of it all?
Yes, but there is also I think it is a fair assessment of the current state of things, right? But at the same time, I do think that there are certain issues with the current state of things, particularly around, you know, when we talk about, healthy communities are made up of healthy individuals, right? So even when we're talking about Instagram, for instance, and the way that it influences how people see themselves, right? And certain aesthetics, whether it's for women or for men, right? And pushes those particular things. And the idea that we are on some level pushed and pulled by the dissatisfaction, right? We are here, we see that, we're dissatisfied, we want to move towards that. So this envy is kind of pulling us in these different directions, right? And yes, there could be ways for us to shift that, but we're still operating under this landscape of dissatisfaction. For me, it's like an emotional health issue, right? At the end of the day, what we need to start focusing on is helping individuals become more like having better emotional health, right? How does someone relate to themselves, right? To their own, whether it's their own intellect or their own physical appearance or their own career or job or whatever they do. Like all of these things are very internal and subtle things, right? That can't really be codified or put into a constitution. We can put a constitution that outlines like how people should act within a society, but the constitution will never deal with these subtleties, right, of how we relate to ourselves. And these are things that need to be taught at a very early stage, and it needs to be taught within a community that kind of protects these things, and it will be different, right? The things that people value within different communities will change, but at least if you give people those basic emotional skills, right, at a young age, then they have the capacity to choose, right? So for instance, by the time you have a majority of the people that's interested in pillaging and raping, you've got a huge problem that started much, much sooner than that, right? It started with the emotional regulation, self-regulation of a child that grew up to be someone who actually wants to pillage. And we could have maybe 5% of the population that's like that, and then 10%, and then 20%. And then we're trying to kind of balance these things out and deal with it with constitutions. But by that time, it's like, it's too late, all right? And it is possible to have the majority of a country that has absolutely no care for the environment, right? They are quite comfortable with completely stripping like entire forests or the sea of all the things, because they're like, well, that really doesn't matter to me at all. But that problem started off at a very, very young age because they don't understand how systems work or action consequence or all of these things. So I think the real like core solution to some of these things comes down to like earlier interventions, but interventions that are based on the individual and emotional health, intellectual health, like creative expression and some of these things. And that's what creates healthy individuals. That's what creates healthy societies. And anything else is just an attempt to mitigate things that have happened in the past. And yes, they are valid, right? It is valid for government to put laws that stop people from doing certain things just to mitigate the harm perhaps that's been collected over decades, right? But to fix that is not an issue so much of changing the laws, right? It's not an issue of shifting the constitution. It's not even an issue of regulating time on Instagram or saying Instagram shouldn't post this or post that. It's something that needs to be done at a much, much earlier level, and just recognizing that we need to start considering like how people feel, right? And teaching them how to do that, or teaching people how to think. Like reasoning is a skill, right? Some people don't learn it, right? And so we shouldn't be surprised when we have adults that are behaving in a way that's unreasonable. They never learned reasoning, right? So these are some of the things that I think we need to start considering. And hopefully within even this kind of community estate model, right? You can, yes, teach all the stuff, math, geography, chemistry, physics, engineering, computer science and art, and like, teach all the like normal stuff, but let's teach the other things too, right? Let's teach community building, right? Let's teach reasoning and philosophy and rhetoric and all these kinds of things, which are just basic ways of living for a human being.
Right. Yeah. Right with you there. There's actually a conference that happened recently called in Acapulco, and this is one of the talks happened by Patrick Smith. He set up this thing called Peaceful Parenting University. This talk goes for 36 minutes, very recommended. He kind of talks about how it's like actually raising your child with the ideas of self-governance and respect for property. And his child unfortunately got leukemia. And had to go through cancer treatments. And he talks about the struggles of maintaining self-ownership and self-governance under those that trial and tribulation with nurses wanting to do procedures to a child which they are used to never gaining the consent of the child and just doing the procedures. So he talks, I've long suspected that, you know, say with the USA, they had a really strong constitution when it was founded. You know, they had a lot of respect for the individual and property rights. But you know, and the culture fought for liberty. However, that was not sustained because, you know, the wealthy were the only ones who, you know, could really afford to perpetuate the education of liberty and of these ideas, where for the majority, they were just influenced by marketing. To then, you know, get into this cycle of constant wants and demands or whatever else, you know, the issues are, where it's like, you know, a delegation of agency. Vote for me, I'll solve your problems. Buy this, it'll solve your problems. And, you know, so there's been like this issue where we, as you know, also went into a little bit, was just this, how we have adults that are still acting, or, you know, they're still acting as a child from a maturity standpoint, in terms of an adult is an independent agent, a capable independent agent, and so many adults are not. And some, you know, a minority of them are, you know, incapable due to mental health issues or physical disabilities or other things. And, you know, that's a role for charity or welfare to kick in and protect. But when we have people who have all the capabilities, who are still demanding that others fulfill their own agency, this is problematic. And this is where I think the founding fathers were too optimistic. They felt that once liberty was granted, it's sustained, but it's not. You need people who continue the tradition of liberty.
And I think maybe as well, it was an issue of there's certain things that you don't, it's like, and there's certain things that you think to codify, right? And certain things that you just don't consider because you don't think of them as a thing. It's like the water that a fish lives in, right? A fish doesn't consider the water, right? Because this is literally what we surround ourselves in. And a lot of times culture is like that, right? It's just the water that we live in, like this fish. So I mean, I'm not sure the mindset or the thinking of the founding fathers of the United States, or even the founding fathers of any or mothers of any nation, right? But sometimes we do, on some level, fail to appreciate the impact of, you know, the things that we can't quite articulate because we just live within them. Right, and we don't teach those things. We don't put those things down. We don't really have a way of passing them on. And actually, interestingly enough, I do think, like, culturally, there is a way that these things get passed on, and they typically get passed on through, like, entertainment, right? Stories that we tell ourselves, that we tell our children. But when you start short-circuiting that entire process, right, and you've got even the storytelling system itself is commercialized to the extent that it's not telling the stories which are most culturally relevant or which have been crafted to benefit, you know, the community, but it's just telling stories that sell, right, and kind of pandering to what the community or what the larger group of people want. It shifts our perception of ourselves. So, for instance, in a smaller community where the the adults are telling kids stories with morals, right? And the moral of the stories, do this, do that. The moral of the stories, don't walk away with strangers. The moral of the stories, you know, when you see someone hungry, give them. Right? They tell these kids stories, and these kids internalize these stories, right? And then they share the stories with their kids, and it kind of becomes like a cultural memory that's passed by, right? From parent to child and community to community. But now you've got, for instance, a situation where a large portion of the stories that are being told, for instance, from Hollywood, right? And this isn't about whether it's right or wrong. It's simply that the stories that are being told would not be an accurate reflection of my reality, right? So I'm living in a community in Zimbabwe. I'm watching Hollywood movies. I do not live that reality. So the lessons that I'm taking from that may not be applicable in my community. And yet I am primed to behave based on the stories and the lessons that I get from stories. So you get people that are acting out particular things that they've learned from movies, what they watch, the music that they listen to, but they're applying them in a context which doesn't necessarily fit, right?
Right.
And so
this is happening a lot in Australia with the youth. Because there's 350 million Americans and only 20 million Australians, the overwhelming amount of consumption of English content consumption is American. And Americans have what I call Americanisms, which is the forgetting that there's countries outside of America.
Well,
so
it's
so
natural
when
as
they
well,
cite,
because you wouldn't expect Americans to create content for Australia. Like everyone creates stories from their own perspective, right? And that's natural.
But it depends on what that perspective is. Like, as an Australian, like, if we're going to cite a statistic, we make sure to say that the statistic is, applicable to Australia. Like because Australia views itself as a small player on a global stage. Whereas, what an Americanism essentially is to think that the only stage is the American stage. So when they would cite a statistic, they wouldn't mention that this is an American statistic. And then you have people from Australia, mostly the youth, consuming this content, and then they're starting to get cultural statistics that they've interpreted as a global or a applicable to them, but it's just not. So for instance, like with animal agriculture, in America, it's mostly factory farms for cattle. When in Australia, it's mostly grass-fed, and that's a huge land difference. So, a lot of Australian vegans, they're poorly informed just because they consumed American content on this. And, there's numerous other examples of that, but it is an issue.
Yeah, and it does come down to this kind of even the cultural feedback loop, right? I mean, we've talked about some on the political side, we've talked about on the economic side, but this cultural aspect of being able to like self-correct, right? And so like you're saying, let's say a situation where you've got Australian vegans who watch American content and they're appalled by the treatment of cattle, assuming that all cattle, even in Australia, is treated or grown the same way, right? But entertainment often serves as a reflection, like culture serves as a reflection of ourselves, right? When I'm talking entertainment culture, we look at something, we're like, oh, that's what's happening. We don't like that. Let's change it. But if you're looking at a mirror that's not that's not showing you, regardless of what's in the mirror, right? But if you look at it and it's not showing you, you lose that ability to self-correct, right? And you may correct in things that aren't even relevant to your particular context. So this idea then of having, even within smaller communities, art is such a vital role, right? Because art is an expression of the people that are there consuming art locally, right? Creating art locally, having songs that are created, movies that are created, books that are created within small communities, right? And then having the ability of this art to be shared broadly within other communities. But it's not that no one should watch American movies or Australian movies or British or whatever movie from whatever place, or Korean movies, right? It's not that, right? It's very also enlightening to watch entertainment from other places. But there just needs to be a place, at least, where you can then actually see things about yourself from your own perspective, from your context, that allows you to judge whether what you're doing is beneficial or not, and kind of correct accordingly. So I think the challenge really is more on the individual, not the communities, to create avenues for this expression, right? Because there's no future in which Hollywood is going to stop making movies, right? Or any particular country, or Japan, or China, or the UK. Like, all of these places have an interest in self-expression, right? And they're going to continue doing it. But the challenge in some of these smaller places, how do we actually encourage that within ourselves and consume our own content and understand ourselves from our own perspective, so that we can just make grow, I think, as a society, so that there's a balance, right? And someone understanding that, yeah, well, this is an American point of view, right? And at the end, you step away from it, like, oh, that's interesting. So this is what's done in America. This is how it's done. But you understand that this isn't all of it. This isn't the universe, literally, that you live in, right? It's just a portion of the world that has this viewpoint and a certain way of doing things. Yeah.
Just two little bits to add on to just the I don't know, the weight of what you just said. On a previous Bevry discussion we did was we did Eastern World War II history, and we looked at 4 different movies that talked about it. But there was also like a little video by Pause and Select. He does these editorials on certain animes. So here I wrote, yeah, just we finished watching Pause and Select series on the intermingling between Japanese events, culture, and anime. All 4 plots are worth watching. But the summary was, so there was this famous movie in the 70s called Akira, and that focused on society with individuals representing the abstractions within larger society. Then there's a famous TV series called Neon Genesis that focused on the individual as society, like existentialism. Then there's this whole YKK focus, which focused on achieving harmony within the everyday. However, then toxic harmony emerged, which is the new challenge of the society. And now we're seeing anime scale to that. So one of the things that a lot of people do, they watch Japanese anime and then they go to Japan, and then they have this little culture shock of like, oh my gosh, Japan isn't like the animes. Japanese have the same issue when they go to Paris. They have this culture shock. And they're like, oh my gosh, Paris isn't like the romance movies. But what it is like a lot of the time, what is projected in the media or entertainment is proposed solutions to cultural issues, right? So there is a cultural issue at the time, and then in movies or art is a way to communicate or express or bring to consciousness this current issue. So right now with Japan, there's a lot of wrestling on trying to deal with toxic harmony, which is a reclaiming of the individual against societal shame. So for instance, like the Makoto Shinkai, I'm not sure I pronounced his first name correctly, but Shinkai did Your Name. He did like 5 centimeters per second, something like that. All his movies are absolutely brilliant. But a lot of them is about the nostalgia of youth, which had all this possibility, and then society coagulating you into a specific unit of expression, which is career. And so his movies are kind of these emotional landscapes. But there was also this article that I read only a few weeks ago. And this was fascinating. So this is a progressive for her for 20 years, very long term. And she wrote this editorial. This did the rounds in the social media networks that I saw. At least it popped up on a Feedly recommendation on the Explore tab. It was she attended this Trump rally, and then she realized Democrats are not ready for 2020. But the takeaway when I read this was she had heard, like she believed that the Democratic Party was this party of unity. And it's marketed as the unity and the cohesive and the party that's wants they want to stand in unity whenever tragedy happens and things like that. And then that the Trump voters or the Republicans are the party that are looked at as if they're always back in the past, or they're nostalgic, or they have all these issues. But then when she actually attended the rally, she realized like, oh, geez, when you actually attend the Republican rallies, they actually have unity. And that's why they're looking for the future, and they care about immigration and protecting all the great things that they have. And then she says, well, the Democratic Party, what they're actually practicing is doom and despair and fragmentation. And that's why they're calling for unity. So it was really interesting where like kind of what they're marketing is actually solutions to the current worldview or the current existence, the current water, and being the fish in the fish tank, right? So like one party, they feel they have something great and they want to preserve it, hence why they care about immigration, and the other party is all fragmented, and then they're calling for unity. And I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah. And sometimes it takes that self-reflection. It takes someone else to hold a mirror up to it and say, well, actually, this is kind of what's happening. And they can be like, so that's what's happening internally. Because when you're in it, you really can't see it, right? The Democrats probably don't, because you're in that kind of situation, so you just don't consider some of these things. And you need someone else sometimes to just hold up a mirror to you and say like, okay, so this is actually what I'm seeing right? And then eventually you can be like, okay, maybe my perspective of myself isn't quite right, or my perspective of other people isn't quite right, right? And then you kind of adjust. But without that ability to reflect, I mean, yeah, we'll just kind of be stuck in the same cycle.
Yeah, I was just kind of thinking, like earlier in our conversation, about for the nomad that kind of is a traveler to the world, they kind of are in that position of being able to step outside of the water, and just in being able to, just by interacting with those that don't share the same cultural like presumptions, you can kind of get an understanding of what your own cultural presumptions are, just so that where other people wouldn't be able to really recognize those, and also be able to see other people's cultural presumptions.
Yeah, I think definitely that's a huge thing with traveling, especially long-term traveling. When you travel to a place for a short period of time, right? Like kind of tourist travel, which is great in itself, but there's certain things that you still don't get a chance to see, right? You don't get your own identity challenged. When you live in a place for a little bit longer, when you start seeing how they see themselves, right? And start seeing yourself from their perspective, and on some level, starting to understand their perspective, you do start to understand just how much we are a collection of the ideas that we grew up in, right? How much of the water that we live in actually fills us. And at that point, you can start saying, okay, well, maybe I've been living this way the whole time, but I don't really actually agree with that. Like everyone does it and I do it, but actually maybe there's a different way, you know, of looking at it. So yeah, in my experience, there's been a lot of that, right? Traveling and seeing how other cultures kind of affect how I look at the world. There's a lot of internal like thinking and considering the structures, but also I always do relate it to my experience in Zimbabwe. I've had some conversations with friends, and this is more anecdotal. Like I don't know how true this is. I'm just kind of passing it along. But there is a German friend that I had who mentioned that in certain cultures, I think earlier on in Germany, I don't think they still do it. Maybe some small cultures do. There was this idea of like almost like a journeyman, right? A certain person who is at a certain point in your life, you wear a particular kind of like a coat or something, and then you just kind of travel. You leave your community and then you go out, all right? And everyone who sees you understands that you're on this kind of journey, all right? And you're learning different things. You can do apprenticeships and pick up skills and different ways of doing things. Then eventually you come back to your community, right? And when you come back, then you've got the opportunity to share all the things that you've seen. And in some way, I do see, at least my experience of being a nomad, it's almost like a journeyman period as well for me, where I'm traveling and I'm looking at the world and I'm seeing different things. I know I probably won't perpetually be a digital nomad, right? At some point I will, well, actually not probably, definitely. I do want to build this estate like we were talking about. So there are things that I want to go back to Zimbabwe and actually apply. But because of my experience of traveling around, I've gotten an opportunity to really like deconstruct some of the things that are happening in Zimbabwe, and not like in just a negative sense, but just kind of like, okay, well, maybe we could do it this way, like instead of this way, and actually coming up with solutions that are being applied by different people in different parts of the world.
Right. This is formalized actually as the hero's journey. And this is something that Bevry actually, at least these discussion groups, founded itself on from Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning. It was about the tales of that, specifically the Egyptian religious ones of it's like Ra, and what's the other, not Ra, the Eye of Horus. Where there was a god situation where the god was kind of tyrannical, and then he became outdated, and then a new king kind of came and then evicted the son, so the son went on a journey, and then but he kept the eye of his father, and he brought it back to the world with a lot more wisdom. So it's kind of maintaining the wisdom of the tradition but refreshing it for modern times. But yeah, there's a book about it, and at least this is the formal concept. It's called The Hero's Journey, and I think this is where I'm kind of at as well, because I just left KL. I left 2+ years of being a digital nomad to settle back in Sydney, and to a lot of extent, like it's a lot of exhaustion from like the visa issues and all the interruptions to your flow and all of that. I mean, it's a great quality of life, sure, but there is a lot of interruptions. And initially when you're traveling, especially when, at least for me, as like a Myers-Briggs ENTP personality, I just chased experiences. I just wanted to accumulate as much experience as I want. But I also kind of realized that around different people, I would adapt to the space. I would fulfill the roles that were requested for me. And this is, a lot of people fall into this, where they are easily led by the situation. And this is also just social, good civil functioning. So for instance, civilly, there's a lot of automatic processes to fulfill good civil interaction. You need to be empathetic and fulfill the space that other people open up to you. And it should be a mutual exchange, a mutual fulfillment. But then there's also the formalized roles of architecture. Like an architect creates the space to facilitate certain behaviors. Like in the lecture theatre, when we go into lecture theatre, we automatically know which way to sit down and which way to face. We know intuitively what to do. And whereas for travelers, a lot of this, as well as, for the old pickup artistry, a lot of this is figuring out how to break these spaces that we're feeling and reclaim agency and become aware of that water. Traveling, pickup artistry is more like a school which teaches you. It's very similar, I guess, to like Buddhism and certain other spiritual schools. But then you also have traveling, which is another type of exposure to it. But at the same time, like, at some point, I think most people, they'll get exhausted or tired from it, and they want to then, they've got the learning and now it's time to act, and that's bringing it back. And I think, to some extent, that's what I realized as well, for myself, which is, I lived, 25+ years in Australia, and I never heard the word libertarian before. Like, this is just unacceptable, in my opinion, like to not have that kind of political awareness in the Australian culture, and we're not particularly politically switched on. And I think, that's kind of being exploited by American entertainment, and, other global issues. And I think, from a lot of things, like the YouTubers who have become successful, like PewDiePie and others, these are people where they're kind of becoming a beacon, like they themselves are becoming a beacon for what they want to see, and then other people join it. And it's kind of turning this, what I see now is this is going to increase. We're turning people who have developed wisdom in isolation for so long, and now we're in the age of conversational wisdom, where we're now kind of interconnecting. But we really need to step it up into collaborative wisdom, or like, cross, increase the cross-pollination, so the wisdom isn't just in other information silos. And that's kind of what Bevry is trying to facilitate through these discussions, as well as through our projects.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Right. You want to, that's probably a good time to stop. We're at
to wrap it up.
3.5 hours, so.
Man, it was...
Yeah, go ahead.
Go, John.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Tabs and also Ben for getting this sort of set up, and this has been a really great conversation. Really cool. A lot of whole storm of ideas out there, and a lot of different topics that are all kind of connected, that kind of jumped around between. It was really interesting to listen to.
Thank you very much for having me, John and Ben. I've really enjoyed this conversation. Really appreciate it. As well, just being able to share with the community as well. So thanks a lot for that.
Cool. And where can people find you and research more? What do you want to plug, Tabs?
So yeah, actually, John had asked this a little bit earlier on when there was the little space where you cut out. But yeah, I mean, I'm setting up a website at the moment called ecologicalestates.com. And there's nothing up there at the moment, but in a week or two, you should be able to see something and kind of follow along with the progress as well, and just get as well a clearer articulation of the concept itself. I think is a good is a good place to start. But I'd also mention that people are free to find me on social media. Taps Murove is my name. So like Instagram or Facebook, or yeah, just feel free to reach out. And if someone's got certain ideas that they're considering or just want to exchange ideas, then I'll be happy to engage on those as well.
Cool.
Excellent. All right.
Alrighty.
Yeah, go ahead, Ben. Sorry.
You can hit the stop live stream button, because when I left, I lost a